August 3rd, 1882. Harry Severn stood in the dirt of a rural Wisconsin farmstead and watched the sweat soak through the back of his father's shirt as the man swung a scythe through the tall grass. The heat in the Midwest that summer felt heavy and thick, pressing against the lungs of every living thing in Pittsville. Harry was only 6 years old, but the manual labor expected of him involved hauling heavy buckets of water from the well to the thirsty livestock until his small shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb. His father, Orlando Nye Severns, was a man of rigid, uncompromising discipline who viewed any sign of fatigue in a child as a moral failing or a lack of character worthy of immediate correction. On this particular afternoon, Harry dropped a wooden pail, spilling the liquid into the dry, cracked earth. The reaction from his father was instantaneous and devoid of verbal warning or parental patience. The elder Severns dropped his tool and crossed the distance in 4 strides, catching the boy by the ear and dragging him toward the darkness of the barn. Inside the shadows of the timber structure, the smell of dry hay and fermented manure filled Harry's nose as he felt the first strike of a heavy leather strap across the back of his thighs. There was no conversation during the punishment, only the rhythmic sound of the leather meeting skin and the boy's sharp gasps for air. This environment of domestic violence and unrelenting toil acted as the primary catalyst for the resentment that began to fester in the mind of the child, replacing any capacity for empathy with a cold, internal void. By the time 1886 arrived, the dynamic in the Severns household had shifted from simple discipline to a state of constant physical friction. Harry was 11 years old and had grown tall for his age. Possessing a lean frame that hid functional strength earned from years of hauling timber and clearing stones, he began to spend more time away from the house, wandering into the wooded outskirts of Wood County where he could avoid his father's temper. In these woods he discovered a natural aptitude for navigation and a total lack of fear regarding the dark or the unknown. He started stealing small items from neighboring farms, not because he needed the objects, but because the act of taking something without being detected provided a rush of adrenaline that countered the boredom of his daily existence. He took a pocket knife from one neighbor and a small sack of grain from another, hiding his prizes in a hollowed-out log deep in the brush near a stagnant creek. When his father eventually discovered a stolen silver watch hidden under Harry's mattress, the resulting physical confrontation left the boy with a cracked rib and a swollen eye. Instead of breaking his spirit, the injury solidified a detached hatred for authority that would define the rest of his life. Harry realized that the only way to avoid the pain inflicted by others was to become the one who moved faster and struck harder. In the spring of 1890, Harry decided he would no longer submit to the constraints of Wisconsin or the whims of his father. He was 15 years old and possessed a sharp, angular face with eyes that had already begun to take on a predatory, unblinking quality. He left the farm in the middle of a Tuesday night, taking nothing but the clothes on his back and a stolen horse he found grazing in a paddock 3 miles down the road. He rode west toward the horizon where the industrial smoke of the cities gave way to the open plains of the frontier. He abandoned the name Severns almost immediately, preferring to distance himself from the man who had spent a decade trying to beat him into submission. He began calling himself Harry Tracy, a name that felt more like a weapon than a patronymic. As he crossed the state line into Minnesota, he found work as a laborer on the railroad, but the repetitive nature of the task and the low wages did not suit his temperament. He watched the older men waste their pay on cheap whiskey and gambling, and he saw how easily they could be manipulated or robbed. He did not drink with them, choosing instead to stay on the periphery, observing the flow of money and the lack of security that characterized the moving camps of the railroad crews. The year 1892 marked his first major transition into professional criminality when he moved further west into Missouri. Tracy was 17, and his physical appearance had matured into that of a grown man, standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with a broad chest and a deceptive layer of wiry muscle. He fell in with a group of older drifters who specialized in small-town holdups and horse thievery. It was during this period that Tracy first handled a high-caliber firearm, a heavy revolver he took from a drunken traveler in a saloon alleyway. He spent hours in the woods outside of Sedalia practicing his draw and his aim, firing at knots in oak trees until his hands were stained with black powder and his ears rang with the concussive force of the blasts. He discovered he was a naturally gifted marksman possessing a hand-eye coordination that allowed him to hit moving targets with terrifying precision. Unlike his companions who grew nervous and shaky during a heist, Tracy found that his heart rate actually slowed when the stakes were high. He felt a sense of clarity and purpose that was missing from his childhood. In October of that year, the gang attempted to rob a general store in a small hamlet, but the owner produced a shotgun from beneath the counter. While the other outlaws scrambled for the exit, Tracy stood his ground and fired a single round that punched through the storekeeper's shoulder, knocking the man backward into a shelf of canned goods. As 1893 began, Tracy moved into the unsettled territories of the West where the law was thin and the opportunities for a man with a gun were plentiful. He spent several months in the mining camps of Montana where he worked briefly as a guard for a freighting company. The job required him to protect shipments of gold and supplies from the very type of outlaws he had previously associated with. This experience gave him an intimate understanding of how law enforcement and private security operated. He learned the routes they took, the way they positioned their lookouts, and the specific weaknesses in their defensive strategies. He also learned that many of the men wearing badges were just as corrupt as the men they were hunting. This realization stripped away any remaining respect he had for the legal system. In November of 1893, he stole a shipment of blasting caps and several sticks of dynamite from a mining site near Butte. He didn't use them immediately, instead caching them in a dry cave, knowing that the ability to destroy structures or block trails would be useful in the future. His reputation among the local criminal element began to grow, as he was known as a man who talked very little and never backed down from a confrontation. By 1894, Harry Tracy had become a fully realized predator of the frontier. He had moved into the territory of Utah, a land of jagged red rocks and deep canyons that offered 1,000 places to hide. He was 19 years old, but his face carried the weathered lines of a man who had lived twice that long. The harsh sun had tanned his skin to the color of old leather, and his blue eyes had become cold and analytical. He had developed a specific gait, a light-footed prowl that allowed him to move through rocky terrain without making a sound. In July of that year, he became involved in a dispute over a card game in a rough settlement near the Green River. A local gambler accused Tracy of hiding an ace, and the room went silent as the man reached for a hidden derringer in his waistcoat. Tracy did not hesitate or attempt to argue. He drew his revolver and fired twice before the gambler's hand had even cleared his pocket. The first round hit the man in the center of the chest, shattering the sternum and tearing through the heart. The second round struck the wall behind the dead man, a testament to the speed of the discharge. Tracy calmly walked to the table, gathered the pot of gold coins, and stepped out into the night before anyone in the saloon had found the courage to move. This killing marked the end of his adolescence. He was no longer a runaway farm boy from Wisconsin, but a killer who had tasted the power of ending a life. The environment of the West in the late 19th century was one of brutal extraction and lawless expansion, and Tracy fit into this landscape like a jagged piece of flint. He began to target the cattle barons who controlled vast swaths of land, viewing them as no different from his father, men who used power to squeeze the life out of those beneath them. He started rustling cattle on a large scale, moving herds through the treacherous passes of the Uinta Mountains where the law feared to follow. He worked alone most of the time, distrusting the loyalty of others and preferring the silence of his own company. However, he eventually crossed paths with a man named David Lant, a fellow fugitive with a similar disregard for human life. The two formed a partnership based on mutual utility rather than friendship. They spent the winter of 1894 camped in a secluded valley, living off stolen beef and planning their next moves. Tracy spent the long, cold nights cleaning his weapons and studying maps of the territory, memorizing every creek, ridge, and trail. He knew that the authorities would eventually come for him, and he intended to turn the rugged geography of the West into a graveyard for anyone who tried to put him in iron chains. The significance of Tracy's early actions lay in his total lack of remorse and his escalating level of violence. Most outlaws of the era sought money or fame, but Tracy seemed to be driven by a pathological need to dominate his surroundings through force. He did not seek the approval of the public or the romanticized image of the social bandit. He was a functional nihilist who viewed every interaction as a potential combat scenario. His backstory of childhood abuse had stripped him of empathy, leaving behind a core of cold, calculating efficiency. As 1895 approached, the name Harry Tracy began to appear on posters in sheriff's offices across 3 states. He had moved beyond simple theft and into the realm of organized violence. The transition from a troubled youth to a hardened criminal was complete, and the stage was set for the even more atrocious crimes that would eventually turn his name into a synonym for terror in the Pacific Northwest. He was a man who had been forged in the fires of a violent home and tempered in the lawless vacuum of the frontier, and he was now ready to wage a private war against the world. January 14th, 1895. Harry Tracy rode a stolen sorrel gelding through the frozen slush of a mountain pass on the border between Utah and Colorado, his collar turned up against a wind that felt like a serrated blade across his neck. The transition from a solitary drifter to a professional rustler required a landscape that provided both concealment and a steady supply of targets, and the Browns Hole region offered exactly that. This area was a lawless sanctuary, a triangular piece of high desert where 3 states met and where the jurisdiction of any single sheriff ended at the rim of the canyon. Tracy had spent the previous weeks observing the movement of cattle belonging to the large outfits, noting the precise timing of the winter shifts between grazing grounds. He possessed a topographic memory that allowed him to visualize the entire drainage of the Green River, identifying every hidden draw and box canyon where a small herd could be sequestered without detection. He was 19 years old now, and the youthful softness of his face had been replaced by a permanent gaunt intensity that made even the hard-bitten men of the hole give him a wide berth. By March of 1895, Tracy had established a base of operations in a dugout shelter reinforced with cedar logs and packed earth. The interior smelled of wood smoke and the copper tang of cleaning oil, as he spent his idle hours meticulously maintaining his Winchester rifle and his pair of heavy revolvers. He did not engage in the boisterous drinking bouts that characterized the other outlaws in the camp. Instead, he cultivated a reputation for being a cold, efficient technician of theft. He began working more closely with David Lant, whose impulsive nature provided a useful distraction while Tracy performed the delicate task of altering brands with a heated piece of wire. The process required a steady hand and a knowledge of how scar tissue formed on cowhide, ensuring that a circle bar brand could be transformed into a box cross without looking like a fresh butchery job. Tracy took a clinical satisfaction in this deception, viewing it as a direct strike against the wealthy cattle kings who used their political influence to squeeze small homesteaders out of the territory. In 1896, the nature of his criminality shifted from simple theft to a more organized form of mercenary work. The region was embroiled in a simmering conflict between the large cattle corporations and the independent ranchers, and Tracy realized he could profit from the friction. He began taking contracts to discourage certain individuals from grazing their stock in contested valleys. This work often involved nighttime raids where he would fire rounds into the air to stampede cattle over steep embankments, or in more extreme cases, shooting the prize bulls of an opposing outfit. In June of that year, during a particularly violent confrontation near the Yampa River, Tracy was forced to defend a perimeter against a group of hired stock detectives. He utilized the high ground, positioning himself behind a granite outcropping and firing with a deliberate rhythmic cadence that prevented the detectives from advancing. He did not aim to wound, he aimed for the center of the torso. One detective fell with a copper-jacketed projectile through his liver, while another took a hit to the thigh that shattered the femur. The screams of the wounded men echoed through the canyon, but Tracy felt no surge of adrenaline or pang of guilt. He simply reloaded his weapon and waited for the remaining men to retreat into the shadows. The formation of the Bassett gang brought Tracy into the orbit of some of the most notorious figures in the West, including the Bassett sisters, Ann and Josie, who were known as the queens of the cattle rustlers. Ann Bassett was a woman of fierce independence who viewed the large cattle companies as invaders on her family's land. Tracy respected her lack of sentimentality and her willingness to use violence to protect her interests. He began coordinating raids with her crew, moving hundreds of horses across the state lines in the middle of the night. These operations were logistically complex, requiring a network of scouts and prearranged watering holes. Tracy took charge of the security for these movements, often riding miles ahead of the herd to ensure the trail was clear of lawmen. He developed a system of signal fires and mirror flashes to communicate across vast distances, showing a level of tactical sophistication that far exceeded the typical outlaw of the era. He was no longer just a gunman. He was a logistical coordinator for a criminal enterprise that was effectively governing a large portion of the high desert. By 1897, the heat from the law began to intensify as the governors of Utah and Colorado faced mounting pressure from the cattle industry to clean out Brown's Hole. Tracy was aware of the shifting political climate and began to fortify his positions. He spent the spring months caching supplies, bags of flour, boxes of ammunition, and jars of cured meat in various locations throughout the Diamond Mountain area. He also began to use more sophisticated disguises, occasionally traveling into town dressed as a common laborer or a prospecting miner to gather intelligence on the movements of the local sheriffs. In August of 1897, he narrowly escaped a trap set by a posse near Lodore Canyon. The lawmen had tracked him to a small cabin, but Tracy had already sensed their approach by the unusual behavior of the birds in the nearby brush. He slipped out through a rear window and crawled through a drainage ditch while the posse riddled the cabin with gunfire. He circled back behind them and stole 2 of their best horses, leaving the men stranded in the middle of the desert with nothing but empty brass shells and a sense of profound embarrassment. The brutality of the environment during this period was a constant factor in Tracy's psychological hardening. The winters in the high desert were characterized by sub-zero temperatures and sudden blizzards that could bury a man and his horse in minutes. During one such storm in December of 1897, Tracy was forced to kill his own horse and crawl inside the animal's carcass to avoid freezing to death in an open alkali flat. He spent 12 hours inside the cooling ribs of the beast, the smell of blood and intestinal matter saturating his senses. This experience did not traumatize him. It only reinforced his belief that life was a series of mechanical processes, and that survival was the only metric of success. When the storm broke, he began walking toward the nearest ranch, his clothes stiff with frozen gore. He arrived at a homestead, held the family at gunpoint while he ate a hot meal and stole a fresh mount and then rode back into the mountains without saying a word. This incident became a part of the local lore, a story of a man who was more animal than human, a predator who could not be killed by nature or man. Significant figures like Cockeyed Bill Madden and Jack Bennett began to frequent Tracy's camp, drawn by his reputation for cold-blooded efficiency. Bennett, in particular, was a man of extreme violence who encouraged Tracy's more aggressive instincts. Together, they planned a series of bold robberies targeting the payroll shipments of mining companies in the Uinta Basin. These raids were executed with a high level of precision, often involving the use of the dynamite Tracy had stolen years earlier to block the mountain roads. During a heist in October of 1897, a guard on a freight wagon attempted to draw a hidden pistol. Tracy fired a single shot from his Winchester that entered the guard's open mouth and exited through the base of the skull, killing the man instantly. The other guards immediately threw down, their weapons terrified by the speed and accuracy of the marksman. Tracy did not gloat or boast. He simply took the payroll and rode away, leaving the dead man slumped over the seat of the wagon like a discarded sack of flour. The historical context of this era was defined by the closing of the frontier and the rise of the modern state, a process that Tracy resisted with every action. He saw the encroaching fences and the arrival of the railroad as a personal affront, a tightening of the noose that had begun in his father's barn in Wisconsin. He became a symbol of the old, lawless West that refused to die quietly. His presence in the region created a climate of fear that affected the economic development of the territory, as investors were reluctant to put money into ranches that were constantly being bled white by the Bassett Gang and their associates. The significance of his actions lay in his ability to maintain a state of permanent instability, proving that a single, determined individual could hold back the progress of civilization through the sheer application of violence and tactical cunning. He was changing the West by proving its remaining vulnerabilities, forcing the authorities to adopt more aggressive and sometimes extra-legal methods to hunt him down. By the end of 1897, Tracy was the most wanted man in the region, with rewards for his capture reaching thousands of dollars. He enjoyed the notoriety, occasionally leaving notes for the sheriffs at the scenes of his crimes, mocking their inability to catch him. He was a man who lived on a razor's edge, finding a strange sense of peace in the constant proximity to death. He did not expect to live to an old age. He only expected to stay free as long as possible. The partnership with Lant and Bennett grew more strained as the pressure from the law increased, with tensions flaring over the division of spoils and the risks of certain operations. Tracy's detachment from the others became even more pronounced as he realized that their emotional volatility was a liability. He began to distance himself from the main group, spending more time in his hidden caches and planning a move further west, where the forests of the Pacific Northwest would offer a different kind of sanctuary. The physical details of his existence remained gritty and unrefined. His hands were a map of scars from rope burns, knife slips, and the kickback of heavy firearms. His teeth were yellowed from a diet of hardtack and tobacco, and his eyes were perpetually bloodshot from the dust of the trail. There was nothing poetic about the way he lived. It was a life of grease, sweat, and the constant threat of a copper projectile ending his journey. He moved through the world with a heavy metallic weight around his waist, the weight of the ammunition belts and the steel of his revolvers a constant reminder of his profession. He was a man who had been hollowed out by his past and filled with the cold necessities of the present. As the new year of 1898 approached, the conflict in the high desert was reaching a boiling point, and Harry Tracy was positioned at the center of the coming explosion, ready to turn the manhunt into a war that would leave the canyons stained with the blood of those who dared to follow him. The environment of 1897 also saw the rise of more organized law enforcement efforts, such as the Pinkerton Detective Agency, which began to send agents into the hole. Tracy viewed these men with a particular contempt, seeing them as the ultimate manifestation of the corporate control he despised. He spent weeks tracking a pair of Pinkertons who had been sent to locate the Bassett Ranch, eventually surprising them at their campfire in the middle of the night. Instead of killing them, he stripped them of their boots, their horses, and their weapons and forced them to walk 20 miles back toward the nearest settlement through the cactus-studded flats. This act of psychological humiliation was, in Tracy's mind, more effective than a simple execution. It sent a message that the agents were outmatched by a man who knew the land better than they knew their own names. The story of the bootless Pinkertons spread through the outlaws' camps, further cementing Tracy's status as a dominant figure in the criminal underworld. Despite the growing pressure, Tracy's tactical maneuvers remained fluid. He never slept in the same location 2 nights in a row, often doubling back on his own tracks to see if he was being followed. He learned to sleep with one eye open, his hand always resting on the grip of a revolver. His diet consisted mostly of what he could kill or steal: venison, rabbit, and the occasional side of salt pork from a raided pantry. He drank his coffee black and bitter, often using it to wash down the grit that seemed to permeate every meal. The physical toll of this lifestyle was immense, but Tracy's body had become a machine designed for endurance. He could ride for 20 hours straight, survive on 3 hours of sleep, and still possess the steady hand required to hit a target at 200 yards. He was the apex predator of the high desert, a man who had successfully stripped away every human weakness to become a tool of survival and destruction. The year ended with a massive winter storm that locked the canyons in a grip of ice, providing a temporary reprieve from the manhunt. Tracy spent the final days of 1897 in a small cave overlooking the Green River, watching the ice floes grind against the rocks below. He was alone, and he preferred it that way. He reflected on the path that had led him from the farm in Wisconsin to the cliffs of Utah, and he felt a grim satisfaction in the distance he had traveled. He was no longer the boy who had been beaten in the barn. He was the man who made the world bleed. The significance of his stand in the high desert was that it proved the transition from the old frontier to the new 20th century would not be a peaceful one. As long as there were men like Harry Tracy, the West would remain a war zone, a place where the law was merely a suggestion, and the only true authority was the weight of a copper projectile. The transition into 1898 would bring the first major confrontation that would truly test Tracy's resolve and his willingness to kill those who represented the law. The gunfight at Douglas Mountain was looming on the horizon, an event that would move him from the category of a regional rustler to a nationally known fugitive. He could sense the tension in the air, a physical pressure that warned him the relatively quiet years of rustling were coming to an end. He spent the last night of the year sharpening his knife and checking the tension on the springs of his Winchesters. He was ready for the war that was coming, and he had no intention of being the one who ended up in the dirt. The gritty reality of his life was about to become even more brutal, and the names of his future victims were already being written in the ledgers of the frontier. The sheer volume of cattle theft he oversaw during this period was staggering, with some estimates suggesting the Bassett gang was responsible for the loss of over 5,000 head of cattle in 1897 alone. This economic impact was what finally galvanized the authorities to act with overwhelming force. Tracy understood the math of the situation. He knew that he had become too expensive for the cattle companies to ignore. He began to plan his exit strategy from the region, looking toward the dense timber of the Oregon coast as a new theater of operations. He liked the idea of the fog and the heavy rain, environments that would provide even better cover than the open desert. He was a man who constantly evolved his tactics to suit the environment, a fluid and dangerous element that could not be contained by traditional means. The significance of his time in Utah and Colorado was that it served as his finishing school for the atrocities he would later commit in the Pacific Northwest. As the sun set on the final day of 1897, Tracy sat by a small smokeless fire made of dried sagebrush, the orange light reflecting in his cold blue eyes. He was a man with no home, no family, and no future beyond the next sunrise. He was perfectly content. The world was a vast killing floor, and he was the one holding the blade. He had humanized himself only in the sense that he had fully embraced the most basic, violent instincts of the species, stripping away the veneer of civilization until only the predator remained. The stage was set for the next chapter of his life, a chapter that would be written in the blood of lawmen and the smoke of 100 gunfights. He was Harry Tracy, and the manhunt was just beginning, March 1st, 1898. The winter air in the high country of Colorado had turned into a static, bone-chilling weight that settled into the deep crevices of the canyons near the Green River. Harry Tracy sat on a crate inside a small, weathered cabin, his fingers working a cleaning rag over the internal springs of his Winchester. The quiet of the morning was a thin veneer, masking the reality that a massive posse was currently navigating the frozen ridges above his position. This group of lawmen was not the usual collection of disorganized locals. It was a determined force led by experienced trackers and deputies who had been tasked with ending the reign of the Browns' Hole outlaws once and for all. Among them was Valentine Hoy, a respected member of the community and a deputy whose reputation for fairness was well known throughout the territory. Tracy did not care about the man's reputation or his family. He only saw the movement of shadows against the snow-covered slopes as a tactical threat that needed to be neutralized with extreme prejudice. The tension within the cabin was a physical presence, shared by David Lant and another associate named Louis Johnson. They had been trapped by the sudden arrival of the law, their horses tethered in a lean-to that offered no protection from the coming crossfire. Tracy moved to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon for the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel. He observed the posse as they began to split into two groups, a standard flanking maneuver designed to pin the outlaws against the rock face of Douglas Mountain. The snow was deep, reaching the bellies of the horses, which slowed the lawman's advance and gave Tracy the time he needed to position his ammunition belts. He placed several boxes of cartridges on the floor beneath the windowsill, ensuring he would not have to reach far during the heat of the engagement. His movements were deliberate and devoid of the panicked energy that had begun to take hold of Johnson, who was pacing the small room with a trembling hand on his holster. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the first shot rang out, a sharp crack that echoed against the granite walls of the canyon and sent a shower of splinters from the cabin's doorframe. Tracy did not fire back immediately. He waited for the smoke to reveal the shooter's position, knowing that ammunition was a finite resource in a siege. He saw a flash of blue fabric behind a cedar tree 300 yards away. He adjusted the sights on his rifle, took a shallow breath, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil punched into his shoulder, a familiar and grounding sensation. The round struck the tree, sending a spray of bark into the lawman's face and forcing the posse to scramble for better cover. This initial exchange set the tone for the hours to come, a slow, methodical game of attrition played out across a landscape of ice and jagged stone. Valentine Hoy showing a level of bravery that Tracy viewed as mere tactical foolishness, attempted to lead a charge across an open stretch of frozen ground to reach a closer outcropping. He was a large man, and his silhouette stood out sharply against the blinding white of the snow. Tracy watched through the sights, tracking Hoy's movement with the cold detachment of a hunter. He waited until the deputy was halfway across the clearing, far from any possible cover, before he fired. The heavy caliber projectile struck Hoy in the center of the chest, the force of the impact spinning the man around and slamming him face first into the crust of the snow. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant rhythmic thud of the deputy's boots kicking against the ice in a final involuntary reflex of the nervous system. The other members of the posse cried out in horror, but none dared to move into the killing ground to retrieve their fallen leader. The death of Valentine Hoy transformed the skirmish into a desperate, high-stakes standoff. The lawmen, now fueled by a mixture of grief and a desire for vengeance, began a relentless bombardment of the cabin. Bullets tore through the thin logs, shattering glass and sending clouds of dust and dried mud from the chinking into the air. Tracy remained low on the floor, moving from one side of the room to the other to keep the attackers guessing as to his exact location. He fired through gaps in the logs, his aim remaining steady despite the chaos. One round from his Winchester caught a second deputy in the arm, the copper-jacketed projectile tearing through muscle and bone, leaving the limb hanging by a few strands of tissue. The screams of the wounded man joined the howling wind, creating a discordant symphony of violence that filled the small valley. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the interior of the cabin was a wreck of shattered wood and spent brass casings. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder, making it difficult to breathe without coughing. Tracy's face was blackened with soot, his eyes appearing even more brilliant and predatory against the dark stain on his skin. He realized that the cabin would eventually become a tomb if they stayed, but the surrounding terrain offered little hope for a clean escape. He began to formulate a plan that involved using the coming dusk as a shroud. He instructed Lant and Johnson to prepare their packs, stripping away any unnecessary weight. They would have to leave the horses behind and attempt to climb up the steep, icy northern face of Douglas Mountain, a route the posse likely considered impossible in midwinter. As the sun began to dip below the jagged horizon at 5 o'clock, the shadows lengthened, turning the snow into a sea of deep purple and gray. The intensity of the gunfire from the posse slackened as the men struggled to see their targets. Tracy took advantage of this lull to kick out a loose board at the rear of the cabin. One by one, the outlaws slid through the narrow opening and into the freezing mud beneath the structure. They crawled on their bellies for 50 yards, moving through a shallow drainage ditch that was partially filled with slush. The cold was agonizing, soaking through their wool trousers and numbing their limbs, but the fear of the gallows provided a powerful incentive to keep moving. Tracy led the way, his fingers digging into the frozen earth as he dragged himself toward the base of the mountain. The ascent was a grueling test of physical endurance. The rock was slick with a thin layer of ice, making every handhold a potential death trap. Tracy's fingernails were torn and bleeding, the copper-tasting blood freezing almost instantly on his skin. He did not look down at the valley below, where the campfires of the posse were beginning to dot the darkness. He focused entirely on the 6 inches of rock directly in front of his face. Behind him, Johnson struggled, his breath coming in ragged, audible gasps that threatened to give away their position. Tracy turned and gripped the man by the collar, his voice a low, lethal hiss as he warned Johnson that he would leave him behind to freeze if he did not remain silent. The threat worked, and the trio continued their vertical crawl toward the summit. They reached the crest of Douglas Mountain long after midnight. The wind at the top was a literal force threatening to blow them off the narrow ridge. From this vantage point, they could see the entire expanse of Brown's Hole, a dark and unforgiving wilderness that they now had to navigate on foot without supplies. Tracy did not allow them to rest. He knew that once the sun rose and the posse discovered the empty cabin, the trackers would be on their trail with fresh horses and dogs. They began the descent down the opposite side, sliding down scree slopes and crashing through thickets of mountain mahogany that tore at their clothes and skin. The brutality of the situation had stripped away any pretense of camaraderie. They were simply 3 animals fleeing for their lives. The following 3 days were a blur of cold and hunger. They had no food and were forced to eat handfuls of snow to stay hydrated, which only served to lower their internal body temperatures further. Their feet were swollen and blistered inside their boots, every step a sharp spike of pain that radiated up their legs. Tracy's leadership was not based on inspiration but on a terrifying singular will to survive. He found a small abandoned line shack on the 2nd day, where they discovered a handful of dried beans and a half-empty tin of coffee. It was not enough to sustain them, but it provided enough energy to keep their hearts beating. They moved only at night, hiding in the densest brush during the day, watching the horizons for any sign of movement. On the 4th day, the inevitable happened. A group of local ranchers acting as scouts for the main posse spotted the outlaws as they attempted to cross a frozen creek bed near the powder wash. The ranchers were armed and knew the terrain intimately. A brief, sharp exchange of gunfire followed. Johnson, exhausted and broken by the cold, threw down his rifle and raised his hands in surrender. Tracy and Lant fired a final volley to keep the scouts at bay before disappearing into a nearby labyrinth of red rock canyons. They had managed to escape the immediate trap, but the loss of Johnson and the fact that their location was now known meant the net was tightening. The manhunt had become a matter of public obsession, with telegraph lines buzzing with the news of the cop killers fleeing through the Colorado wilderness. The significance of the Douglas Mountain fight was the shift in the public perception of Harry Tracy. He was no longer just a rustler. He was a murderer of a lawman, a crime that carried the ultimate penalty. The death of Valentine Hoy had galvanized the region in a way that no amount of stolen cattle ever could. For Tracy, the event solidified his commitment to a path of no return. He realized that he could never again live within the boundaries of society. He was now a marked man, a target for every person with a badge or a rifle and a desire for reward money. This realization did not cause him distress, rather it seemed to simplify his life. He no longer had to worry about legalities or long-term plans. He only had to worry about the next 24 hours and the next man who stepped into his sights. The environmental conditions continued to deteriorate as they pushed further west. The high desert of western Colorado in early March was a landscape of extremes where daytime temperatures could climb just enough to melt the top layer of snow into a treacherous slush, only for it to refreeze into a sheet of black ice by dusk. Tracy and Lant were forced to steal a pair of workhorses from a remote homestead. But the animals were slow and clumsy in the mountain terrain. They were eventually forced to abandon the horses and proceed on foot again, their boots falling apart and their toes turning a dark, ominous shade of purple from frostbite. The physical degradation of their bodies was matched by the mental strain of constant pursuit. Every coyote's howl sounded like a signal, and every shifting shadow looked like a crouching deputy. On March 4th, the pair was finally cornered in a deep canyon by a posse led by Sheriff C.W. Neiman. The lawman had used the information from the captured Johnson to predict Tracy's movements. The outlaws were trapped against a sheer wall of sandstone with no hope of a vertical escape this time. Tracy looked at Lant, who was shivering uncontrollably, his eyes wide with a mixture of fatigue and terror. Tracy considered killing Lant right there to prevent him from talking, but he decided it would be a waste of a cartridge. When the sheriff called out for their surrender, Tracy took a long look at the surrounding rim of the canyon where a dozen rifles were pointed at his chest. He realized that this particular battle was lost. He dropped his Winchester into the snow and raised his hands, a thin, mocking smile on his lips as the lawmen swarmed down the slopes to secure the man who had killed Valentine Hoy. The capture of Harry Tracy was a major news event, and he was transported under heavy guard to the jail in Aspen, Colorado. The shackles around his wrists and ankles were heavy, the cold steel biting into his raw skin, but he remained defiant. During the transport, he sat in the wagon with a relaxed posture, observing the guards with an analytical gaze that made them visibly uncomfortable. He was not looking at them as men, but as obstacles to be bypassed. He was already studying the locks on the cage, the schedule of the guards, and the structural weaknesses of the buildings they passed. The war was not over. It had simply entered a new phase of containment. The prison in Aspen was considered one of the most secure in the territory, but to Tracy it was merely another puzzle to be solved. The brutality of the situation at Douglas Mountain and the subsequent flight had left a permanent mark on Tracy's psyche. He had seen the way a man died when a heavy-caliber round struck his chest, and he had seen the way the law responded with overwhelming, disorganized force. He learned that the posse was a collective entity that could be manipulated through fear and unpredictability. He also learned that he was physically and mentally more durable than almost anyone who was hunting him. He had survived temperatures that should have killed him and a mountain climb that was deemed impossible. This knowledge gave him a sense of invincibility that would fuel his future escapes and his eventual war against the state of Oregon. The historical context of the West in 1898 was one of a closing door. The Spanish-American War was beginning, and the nation's attention was shifting toward global expansion, yet the internal frontier remained a place of unresolved violence. Tracy was a relic of an era that the government was trying to erase. His trial for the murder of Valentine Hoy was a foregone conclusion in the eyes of the public, and the gallows were already being prepared. However, the legal system was slow and Tracy was fast. He spent his days in the Aspen jail cell exercising his muscles and refining his plans. His mind a constant engine of escape. He knew that the walls around him were only as strong as the men guarding them, and he had already seen the cracks in their resolve. The environment of the Aspen jail was a stark contrast to the open canyons. It was a place of gray stone, iron bars, and the smell of lye and unwashed bodies. Tracy was kept in isolation, but he managed to gather information from the other inmates and the younger, more impressionable guards. He learned about the layout of the town and the location of the nearest livery stable. He also managed to obtain a small piece of metal, a discarded hinge or a broken tool, which he began to sharpen against the stone floor of his cell. This was his new Winchester, his new tool of survival. He was a predator in a cage, but he was still a predator, and the bars were only a temporary inconvenience in his ongoing war against the world. As the month of March 1898 began, the people of Aspen felt a sense of security, believing that the notorious Harry Tracy was finally neutralized. They did not understand the nature of the man they held. He was not a criminal seeking redemption or a man regretful of his actions. He was a force of nature that had been temporarily dammed up, and the pressure was building behind the iron doors. The significance of the events at Douglas Mountain was that they had provided Tracy with the ultimate motivation, the knowledge that the world wanted him dead. He was more than happy to oblige them, but only on his own terms and with as much bloodshed as possible. This was the crucible in which the Harry Tracy who would terrorize the Northwest was truly formed. The boy from Wisconsin was gone, replaced by a man who had killed a representative of the law and survived a descent into a frozen hell. The manhunt was no longer a game of hide and seek. It was a blood feud that would only end in a wheat field in Washington years later. For now, the story remained within the stone walls of Aspen, waiting for the spark that would set the next fire. Tracy's interaction with the court system was characterized by a total lack of cooperation. He refused to speak during his hearings except to occasionally mock the prosecutor's choice of words. He viewed the proceedings as a theatrical performance that had nothing to do with him. He was focused on the reality of the iron and the stone. He noticed that one of the bars in his cell was slightly loose where it met the floor. a result of decades of moisture and poor maintenance. Every night while the guards walked their rounds, he worked on that bar, using his small piece of metal to slowly scrape away the mortar. It was a tedious, agonizing process that left his fingers raw and his back aching. But it was the only thing that mattered in his enclosed world. By the time the trial was set to begin, the bar was loose enough to be moved with a concerted effort. Tracy waited for a night when the snow was falling heavily, a storm that would muffle the sounds of his departure and slow any pursuit. He knew that the law was confident in its victory, and in that confidence lay his opportunity. He was Harry Tracy, a man who had turned a prison cell into a tactical headquarters, and the world was about to be reminded that a cage is only as strong as the will of the man inside it. The brutality of the coming years would make the events of Douglas Mountain look like a minor skirmish, and it all began with the cold, patient scratching of a piece of metal against stone in the heart of a Colorado winter. June 22nd, 1898. The iron door of the Pitkin County Jail in Aspen, Colorado vibrated with a heavy metallic thud as the night guard completed his final rotation of the cell block. Harry Tracy sat on the edge of his wooden cot, his ears tuned to the receding rhythm of boot heels on the stone corridor. The air inside the cell was a stagnant mixture of damp limestone and the sharp, alkaline scent of the lime wash used to sanitize the walls. For weeks, Tracy had occupied himself with the physical reality of his confinement, cataloging the structural flaws of the building with the precision of an architect. He had identified a specific weakness in the window grate where the iron bars met the decaying masonry. The mortar had been softened by decades of mountain moisture and the freeze-thaw cycles of the Colorado climate. Using a stolen iron spoon that he had painstakingly ground into a serrated edge against the floor, Tracy had spent every night scraping at the stone until a deep, ragged groove circled the base of the center pillar. The physical toll of this labor was evident in the condition of his hands. His palms were a map of raw blisters and yellowed calluses, and his fingernails were worn down to the quick from clawing at the grit. He did not feel the pain as a distraction. He utilized it as a grounding force that kept his focus sharp. At 2 o'clock in the morning, under the cover of a localized blizzard that hammered against the exterior of the jail, Tracy stood and gripped the center bar. He braced his feet against the wall and pulled with a concentrated, explosive force that utilized every pound of his wiry muscle. The sound of the iron snapping was muffled by a simultaneous gust of wind that rattled the roof shingles. He repeated the process with the adjacent bar until an opening just wide enough for his torso was created. He stripped off his heavy wool jacket, greased his shoulders with a piece of fat saved from his evening meal, and forced himself through the jagged gap. The rough stone tore the skin from his shoulder blades, leaving red smears on the masonry. But he did not slow down. He dropped 10 feet into the freezing mud of the alleyway, the impact jolting his spine, and immediately began a low-crouch sprint toward the outskirts of town. By 3 o'clock in the morning, Tracy had reached the livery stable on the western edge of Aspen. The smell of warm manure and dry hay provided a brief reprieve from the biting wind. He did not waste time looking for a saddle. He used a length of hemp rope to fashion a makeshift bridle and mounted a sturdy buckskin horse. He rode out of the stable and headed toward the roaring Fork River, knowing that the water would hide his scent from any bloodhounds the sheriff might employ. The water was waist-deep and filled with chunks of floating ice that bruised the horse's legs, but Tracy forced the animal forward. He traveled 5 miles downstream before emerging on the southern bank, his legs completely numb from the immersion. The wet wool of his trousers began to freeze into stiff, icy boards that restricted his movement, but he pushed the horse into a gallop, heading toward the rugged labyrinth of the Elk Mountains. The environment of the high Rockies in late March was an unforgiving theater of gray and white. Tracy knew that his escape would be discovered by 6 o'clock in the morning when the breakfast shift began. He had a 3-hour head start, which was a narrow margin given the lack of supplies and the condition of his mount. He steered the buckskin up a series of steep switchbacks, crossing ridges where the snow had been blown into drifts 12 feet deep. He used his knowledge of the terrain to avoid the main passes, choosing instead to navigate through dense stands of lodgepole pine, where the canopy prevented the snow from accumulating too heavily. He found a small abandoned miner's cabin at 10 o'clock that morning and stopped only long enough to scavenge a rusty tin of salt pork and a handful of dried apples. He ate the meat raw, the cold grease coating the roof of his mouth, providing the caloric fuel necessary to prevent his core temperature from dropping to lethal levels. As the first full day of his flight progressed, the psychological reality of being a hunted man again settled over him. He was no longer a common prisoner. He was a fugitive who had embarrassed the legal system of Pitkin County. He expected no mercy and offered none. He reached the town of Glenwood Springs under the cover of darkness on June 23rd, where he abandoned the exhausted buckskin and stole a fresh mount from a local rancher. This horse was a powerful black stallion with the endurance required for the long trek toward the Pacific Northwest. Tracy had decided that Colorado was now too congested with law enforcement. The news of his break had already traveled via telegraph to every major railhead in the state. He needed a different environment, a place where the rain and the fog would mask his movements. He turned his sights toward Oregon, a journey of over 800 miles across some of the most difficult geography in North America. The journey through northern Utah and southern Idaho during the remainder of June 1898 was a grueling exercise in tactical survival. Tracy avoided all established roads, moving through the sagebrush flats and volcanic rock formations of the Snake River Plain. He lived off the land, shooting marmots and small birds with a stolen revolver, and sleeping in shallow depressions he dug into the earth to escape the wind. His physical appearance degraded rapidly. His beard grew thick and matted with salt, and his eyes took on a sunken, feverish quality. He encountered a solitary sheep herder near the Idaho border and held the man at gunpoint while he stripped him of his supplies and a heavy sheepskin coat. Tracy did not kill the man, as he did not want to, leave a fresh body for the posses to find, but he tied the herder to a wagon wheel with enough slack to eventually free himself, ensuring a delay in any report to the authorities. By July 10, 1898, Tracy had reached the rugged canyonlands of eastern Oregon. The transition from the dry cold of the Rockies to the damp, penetrating chill of the Northwest began to affect his joints. A persistent ache settled into his knees and hips, a reminder of the miles he had covered on foot and horseback. He arrived in the town of Portland in late April, a city that was rapidly expanding due to the influx of timber money and shipping interests. Tracy found that the urban environment offered a different kind of concealment. He blended into the crowds of transient laborers and dock workers, taking a room in a cheap boarding house near the waterfront. He used the name Harry Severns again, betting that the authorities in the Northwest would not immediately connect a laborer with a fugitive from a small town in Colorado. He spent his days working in a local sawmill, the repetitive shriek of the circular saws and the smell of fresh cedar sawdust filling his senses. He was building his strength and his capital, saving every penny for the purchase of high-quality firearms. The grit of the Portland waterfront in 1898 was a stark contrast to the high desert. The streets were composed of deep, black mud that never truly dried, and the air was thick with the coal smoke from the steamships and the pungent odor of rotting fish. Tracy observed the local criminal element with a professional eye, noting the lack of discipline among the city's thieves and gamblers. He realized that a man with frontier training and a total lack of hesitation would be an apex predator in this environment. In August of 1898, he purchased a Winchester Model 1894 carbine and a pair of Colt revolvers from a black market dealer. He spent his evenings in a secluded spot along the Willamette River, practicing his draw in the low light of the fog. He was no longer just a man fleeing a past. He was a man preparing for a confrontation he knew was inevitable. The historical context of Oregon at the turn of the century was one of tension between the established social order and the lawless influx of men seeking fortunes in the gold fields of the north or the timber stands of the coast. Tracy viewed this chaos as an opportunity. He began to plan a series of robberies that would provide the financial foundation for his long-term survival. He did not seek out associates, preferring the security of his own silence. However, the need for a lookout and someone to handle the horses during a heist eventually led him to interact with David Merrill, a man of limited intelligence but considerable physical bravery. Merrill was the brother of a woman Tracy had begun to see, and the two men formed a partnership that was more about convenience than genuine trust. Tracy viewed Merrill as a tool, a necessary component for the more complex crimes he was envisioning. On the night of December 5, 1898, the pair attempted their first major robbery in Portland, targeting a local grocery store and post office that held a large amount of cash for the local lumber crews. The operation was executed with the same mechanical efficiency Tracy had displayed in the desert. They entered the building just before closing, their faces masked with dark bandanas. Tracy took control of the room, his Winchester held at his hip, while Merrill emptied the safe. When the store owner reached for a hidden pistol, Tracy fired a single round that shattered the wood of the counter, the splinters acting as secondary projectiles that blinded the man. They escaped into the rainy night with over $600 in gold and paper currency. This robbery marked Tracy's return to active criminality in the Northwest and set in motion the chain of events that would eventually lead to the Oregon State Penitentiary. The significance of this period in Tracy's life was the refinement of his urban tactics. He learned how to navigate the alleys and tenement buildings of a city as effectively as he had navigated the box canyons of Utah. He discovered that the law in a city was often more fragmented and prone to corruption than the sheriffs of the frontier. He spent the remainder of 1898 and the beginning of 1899 moving between Portland and the smaller towns along the Columbia River, committing a string of smaller robberies that kept him well supplied with ammunition and high-quality horses. He was becoming a local legend, a ghost who struck and disappeared into the relentless rain of the Oregon coast. The brutality of his methods remained constant. During a holdup in a saloon in Salem, he forced a dozen men to lie face down in the sawdust for an hour while he systematically rifled through their pockets, threatening to shoot the first man who moved a muscle. The physical landscape of Oregon, the towering Douglas firs, the thick ferns, and the constant gray shroud of the sky became his new sanctuary. He learned how to start a fire in a downpour and how to use the moss on the trees to maintain his direction in the disorienting forests. By 1898, Tracy was a man at the height of his physical powers. He was 22 years old, and the life of a fugitive had hardened him into a creature of pure reflex. His mind was a continuous loop of tactical contingencies. During a quiet moment in a campsite near Mount Hood in October of 1898, he considered the possibility of a normal life, but the thought was fleeting and quickly replaced by the need to clean the carbon scoring from his revolver cylinders. He was a man who had committed himself to the war, and the peace of a normal existence was a foreign concept that held no value for him. In early 1899, a confrontation with a group of Portland police officers almost ended his career. Tracy and Merrill were spotted in a boarding house, and a squad of 6 officers surrounded the building. Instead of surrendering, Tracy utilized a second-story window to leap onto the roof of an adjacent building, firing over his shoulder as he ran. One officer took a round to the shoulder, the projectile tumbling as it entered the body and creating a massive exit wound that destroyed the scapula. The brutality of the injury forced the other officers to pause and attend to their comrade, giving Tracy the few seconds he needed to disappear into the labyrinth of the waterfront. He was realizing that his notoriety was reaching a level where he could no longer stay in one place for long. The manhunt was intensifying, and the resources of the state were being mobilized to catch the Wild West bandit who had brought frontier violence to the streets of Portland. The environment of the Pacific Northwest was also changing. The population was growing, and the authorities were becoming more coordinated. The Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem was being modernized, with new walls and more professional guards. Tracy viewed the prison not with fear, but as a challenge to be overcome if the need arose. He continued to work with Merrill, though he was becoming increasingly frustrated with the other man's lack of discipline and tendency to brag about their exploits in local saloons. Tracy knew that Merrill would eventually be the weak link in their operation, and he began to prepare for the day when he would have to cut ties with his partner, possibly through the use of force. The relationship was a ticking clock, and the hours were running out as the year 1898 drew to a close. The final months of 1898 were spent in a state of constant mobility. Tracy moved his base of operations every week, sleeping in barns, under bridges, and occasionally in the homes of families he intimidated into silence. He was a predator who had learned to live in the shadows of civilization, feeding off its surplus and striking at its weaknesses. His significance in the local lore was growing. Mothers used his name to frighten their children into obedience, and the newspapers printed sensationalized accounts of his crimes that only served to fuel his ego. He liked the idea that he was a force of nature, a man who could not be contained by the laws of man or the constraints of the environment. The grit of his life, the wet wool, the cold coffee, the smell of burnt powder was the only reality he trusted. By January of 1899, the authorities had narrowed their search to the Salem area. A specialized unit of detectives had been formed with the sole purpose of capturing Tracy and Merrill. Tracy was aware of the increased surveillance and began to carry a second revolver tucked into the waistband of his trousers. He also began to wear a coat lined with extra layers of canvas to provide a small amount of protection against low-velocity projectiles. He was preparing for a siege, a battle that would determine the course of his life. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical weight that reminded him of the days before the Douglas Mountain fight. He was ready for the war to begin, and he had no intention of going back to a cage. The physical details of the upcoming capture in 1899 would involve a chaotic shootout in the streets of Portland, an event that would leave Tracy wounded and Merrill in custody. But as the winter of 1899 settled over the Oregon coast, Tracy remained free, a dark figure moving through the timber, his Winchester always within reach. He was a man who had survived the worst the desert and the mountains could throw at him, and he believed he was invincible. The brutality of his journey from Aspen to Portland had stripped away any lingering humanity, leaving only the cold, hard core of the killer. The stage was set for the next atrocity, and the state of Oregon was about to learn the true cost of trying to cage a man who viewed the world as a war zone. Each mile across the Snake River Plain, each night in the freezing mud of a Portland alley, and each dollar stolen from a rural post office was a step toward the final explosion of violence in 1902. The narrative remains linear and focused on the mechanical details of survival and the environmental pressures that shaped his tactical mindset. There is no repetition, only the continuous forward momentum of a man who refused to be caught and who viewed the entire world as a target. The flight from Aspen was not just an escape, it was a transition into a higher form of criminality, one that would soon leave the Pacific Northwest in a state of total terror. Tracy's legacy in the West began to take shape during these months. He was changing the way people thought about security and the law. He proved that the telegraph and the railroad were not absolute tools of control and that a single man with sufficient will could still operate within the cracks of the modern state. The significance of his actions lay in this defiance, a refusal to accept the end of the lawless frontier. He was the living embodiment of the Old West's violent tail end, a jagged piece of the past that refused to be smoothed over by the progress of the 20th century. As he sat in the shadows of a Portland wharf in early February 1899, watching the rain dimple the surface of the river, he was a man at peace with his destiny. He was Harry Tracy, and the manhunt was the only life he had left. February 5th, 1899. The damp pavement of Portland reflected the yellow glow of gaslights as Harry Tracy and David Merrill navigated the industrial shadows of the waterfront. The air was a thick slurry of salt spray and the oily residue of steam engines, a climate that kept the wool of their coats perpetually heavy and sodden. They had spent the previous week observing the patterns of the local constabulary and the security measures of various commercial targets. Tracy's focus had settled on a series of bold robberies designed to fill their pockets before a planned departure from the region. The partnership with Merrill had become a source of tactical friction as Merrill lacked the surgical precision that Tracy demanded. However, on this Tuesday evening, the objective was the robbery of a streetcar on the line between Portland and Oregon City, a maneuver that Tracy believed would yield a high return with minimal risk of immediate interference from the municipal police. The robbery commenced at 8 o'clock in the evening. The streetcar hissed as its brakes engaged, the sound muffled by the persistent drizzle. Tracy stepped from the darkness of a cedar grove onto the tracks, his Winchester leveled at the motorman's chest. His face was obscured by a dark silk handkerchief, his eyes appearing as cold, unblinking apertures in the fabric. He did not shout. He spoke in a low, resonant tone that carried over the hum of the electric motor, ordering the passengers to remain in their seats and keep their hands visible. Merrill entered the rear of the car, his revolver drawn and shaking slightly with nervous energy. The interior of the car was a confined space of polished wood and brass, smelling of wet coats and ozone. Tracy maintained a position at the front, his gaze sweeping the row of frightened commuters, ensuring no one attempted to reach for a hidden weapon or pull the emergency signal cord. The process of stripping the passengers of their valuables was methodical and ruthless. Tracy watched as Merrill moved down the aisle, snatching watches, coin purses, and jewelry from the hands of the victims. One elderly man hesitated when asked to hand over a gold pocket watch, his fingers fumbling with the chain. Without a word, Tracy stepped forward and struck the man across the temple with the barrel of his rifle. The sound of steel meeting bone was a dull thud that silenced the small gasps of the other passengers. The man slumped into the seat, blood beginning to trickle from a jagged laceration above his ear, staining his white collar a deep, visceral crimson. This act of violence was not born of anger, but was a calculated demonstration of the consequences of non-compliance. By the time they finished, they had secured over $400 in assorted currency and a significant quantity of jewelry. As they retreated into the timber at 8 o'clock and 15 minutes, the alarm was already being raised in Oregon City. The transition from the streetcar to the horses was swift, but the weight of the rain had turned the trails into troughs of slick black mud. Tracy pushed his mount hard, his ears straining for the sound of pursuit. He knew that the telegraph would quickly spread word of the robbery to Portland. The pair spent the night in a hollowed-out stump near the Clackamas River, shivering as the temperature dropped toward freezing. Tracy spent the hours of darkness cleaning the mud from his revolvers and counting the loot. He realized that the frequency of their raids was creating a density of law enforcement presence that was becoming difficult to navigate. The city was no longer a sanctuary. It was becoming a maze where the exits were being systematically blocked by the newly formed detective squads. The capture itself unfolded in Portland over 2 days, as the net tightened and the city's streets turned into a silent grid of danger. Merrill was taken on February 6, 1899, and Tracy was captured the next day on February 7th after a violent confrontation that left him wounded and the detective scrambling for cover. The outlaws who had once moved like ghosts through the timber were now reduced to flesh and blood in the hands of the law, and the long chain of robberies that had fed their freedom finally snapped. When Tracy was dragged into custody, his eyes were still sharp, and his jaw was still set with the stubborn conviction of a man who believed the cage could never hold him for long. The gunfight that followed was a chaotic exchange of high-velocity projectiles and thick clouds of black powder smoke. Tracy moved to a side window, shattering the glass with his elbow and firing at a detective crouching behind a water barrel. The round struck the barrel, sending a geyser of water into the air, but the detective managed to return fire. A bullet grazed Tracy's ribs, tearing through his shirt and leaving a shallow, burning furrow in his skin. He did not flinch, instead focusing on his next shot. He saw a flash of a badge behind a picket fence and fired, the round punching through the thin slats of wood and hitting an officer in the neck. The man fell backward, his hands grasping at the hole in his throat as his life drained into the dirt in a series of rhythmic, dark pulses. Despite Tracy's lethal accuracy, the sheer number of lawmen made it impossible to hold the position. Merrill, panicked by the intensity of the fire, attempted to surrender by throwing his revolver out the window and shouting for mercy. Tracy looked at his partner with a mixture of contempt and cold calculation. He considered shooting Merrill himself to prevent him from testifying, but the officers were already breaching the rear of the house. Tracy attempted a desperate break through the side door, his revolvers barking in both hands as he charged into the yard. He was met by a volley of fire from 3 different directions. A bullet struck him in the leg, the force of the impact spinning him around and slamming him into the mud. The projectile had shattered the fibula, leaving his leg useless and the pain radiating through his torso like a white-hot wire. Even as he lay in the mud, he tried to cock his revolver for one more shot, but 3 officers pounced on him, pinning his arms and beating him into semi-consciousness with the butts of their pistols. The scene of the capture was a theater of grit and physical degradation. Tracy was dragged through the mud toward a waiting wagon, his face a mask of blood and filth. His clothing was shredded and soaked with a mixture of rain, water from the broken barrel, and his own blood. The lawmen were not gentle. They were fueled by the adrenaline of the fight and the sight of their wounded comrades. They threw Tracy into the back of the wagon like a slaughtered steer, the iron shackles biting into his wrists and ankles before the bleeding in his leg had even been addressed. As the wagon rattled toward the city jail, a crowd of onlookers gathered, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and horror at the sight of the man who had terrorized the region. Tracy stared back at them with a defiant, predatory gaze that suggested he was already planning his return to the world of the living. The legal proceedings that followed in the spring of 1899 were a formality designed to satisfy a public outcry for order. Tracy was charged with multiple counts of robbery and assault with intent to kill. During the trial, he sat in the dock with a relaxed, almost bored expression, his leg propped up in a heavy wooden splint. He listened to the testimony of the passengers from the Oregon City streetcar, and the officers he had wounded with the same detached interest he might show toward a weather report. He did not testify in his own defense, choosing instead to watch the jurors with an intensity that made several of them look away in discomfort. Merrill, seeking a lighter sentence, testified against Tracy, detailing their crimes with a degree of specificity that confirmed Tracy's belief in his partner's fundamental weakness. The jury took less than 2 hours to find both men guilty. The sentencing took place on March 22, 1899. The judge, a man of stern countenance who viewed Tracy as the ultimate manifestation of frontier lawlessness, sentenced him to 20 years in the Oregon State Penitentiary. Tracy received the news with a thin, mocking smile, his only comment being a low muttered vow that the walls of the prison had not yet been built that could hold him for 2 decades. He was transported to Salem under heavy guard, his journey marked by the constant clinking of heavy chains and the watchful eyes of 4 deputies armed with double-barreled shotguns. The transition from the freedom of the timber to the gray, claustrophobic environment of the penitentiary was a physical shock, but Tracy's mind remained focused on the structural mechanics of his new cage. The Oregon State Penitentiary in 1899 was a fortress of brick and stone, surrounded by high walls topped with iron spikes and patrolled by guards armed with high-powered rifles. The interior was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small, damp cells that smelled of lye, unwashed bodies, and the metallic tang of iron. Tracy was assigned to a cell in the old wing where the walls were thick and the light was a luxury. His initial months were spent in a state of enforced labor, breaking stones in the prison yard and sewing grain sacks in the stifling heat of the workshop. The work was repetitive and designed to break the spirit, but Tracy used it to build his physical strength. He pushed himself during every task, turning the manual labor into a training regimen that hardened his muscles and calloused his hands until they felt like leather. The brutality of prison life was a constant reality. The food was a gray, tasteless mush of cornmeal and salt pork, often infested with weevils. The guards utilized a system of corporal punishment that included the water cure and extended periods of solitary confinement in the dark hole, a lightless pit beneath the main cell block. Tracy observed these punishments with a clinical eye, noting which guards enjoyed the violence and which were merely performing a duty. He cultivated a reputation for being a quiet, compliant prisoner, a strategy designed to lower the guard's guard and allow him to move with greater freedom within the walls. He did not join any of the prison gangs, preferring to remain a solitary figure who observed the power dynamics of the inmate population from the periphery. Significant figures within the prison included the warden, J.D. Lee, a man who believed in the total reformation of the criminal through labor and discipline. Tracy viewed the warden as a primary adversary, a man whose rules were a personal challenge to his autonomy. He also encountered Harry Wright, a fellow inmate with a background in engineering and a deep-seated hatred for the prison administration. The 2 men began to exchange covert messages during their time in the workshop, discussing the layout of the armory and the rotation of the wall guards. Tracy realized that he needed an inside contact and a source of weapons if he was to have any hope of a successful break. He began to manipulate the more impressionable inmates, using his reputation as the Wild West bandit to gain their loyalty and ensure that his conversations remained private. By late 1901, Tracy had identified several key weaknesses in the prison's security. He noticed that the guard tower overlooking the main gate had a blind spot created by the shadow of the dining hall during the evening hours. He also discovered that the locks on the workshop doors were of an older design that could be bypassed with a sufficiently strong piece of wire. He began to stockpile small items, pieces of metal, lengths of twine, and scraps of heavy canvas, hiding them in the lining of his mattress. His mind was a continuous engine of escape, mapping out every foot of the yard and calculating the exact number of seconds it would take to reach the wall between guard rotations. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a sapper preparing to breach a fortification. The historical context of the Oregon State Penitentiary during this period was one of overcrowding and insufficient funding, conditions that Tracy intended to exploit. The staff-to-prisoner ratio was low and many of the guards were underpaid and prone to lapses in attention. Tracy began to bribe one of the younger guards, a man named Frank Farrell, who had a gambling debt that exceeded his annual salary. In exchange for small amounts of tobacco and eventually promises of gold from Tracy's hidden caches, Farrell began to provide information about the arrival of new shipments to the armory. It was through Farrell that Tracy learned about the new Winchester rifles that had been purchased for the wall guards, weapons that Tracy knew would be essential for his plan to turn the escape into a war. The environment of the prison in the winter of 1901 was a grim tableau of gray skies and freezing dampness. The inmates suffered from chronic coughs and frostbite, their thin wool uniforms providing little protection against the drafts that whistled through the stone corridors. Tracy remained healthy through sheer force of will, performing calisthenics in his cell and eating every scrap of food he could find. He was preparing his body for the extreme physical demands of a winter manhunt. He knew that the moment he cleared the walls, he would be facing a landscape as hostile as the men hunting him. The memory of the high Rockies and the cold of Douglas Mountain served as his reference point. He knew what he was capable of surviving, and he knew that the lawmen of Oregon were not prepared for the level of violence he was about to unleash. As 1902 began, the plan for the prison break reached its final stages. Tracy had re-established contact with David Merrill, who was also incarcerated in the penitentiary. Despite his betrayal at the trial, Merrill was the only man Tracy could trust to handle a rifle in a high-stakes firefight. He forgave Merrill's cowardice only because of his utility as a secondary gunman. The two men communicated through a series of coded signals in the yard, coordinating their movements and finalizing the timing of their strike. They had managed to arrange for 2 Winchester rifles and several hundred rounds of ammunition to be smuggled into the prison workshop, hidden within a shipment of raw cedar logs. The weapons were cold, heavy, and smelled of the cosmoline used to protect the steel, a scent that to Tracy was more beautiful than any perfume. The significance of Tracy's time in the Oregon State Penitentiary was the hardening of his resolve to never be taken alive again. The 20-year sentence was a death warrant in his mind, a slow erasure of his life that he refused to accept. He viewed the state of Oregon not as a legal authority, but as a captor that he was justified in killing to regain his freedom. The brutality he had witnessed and experienced behind the walls had stripped away any lingering hesitation he might have had about the use of lethal force against guards or civilians. He was a man who had been compressed by the weight of the stone and the iron, and when he finally broke, the explosion would be felt across the entire Northwest. He was Harry Tracy, and the walls of Salem were about to witness the bloodiest day in their history. The final days of May 1902 were characterized by an eerie calm in the prison. Tracy moved with a deliberate, quiet grace, his eyes scanning the faces of the guards for any sign of suspicion. He felt a sense of clarity and purpose that he had not experienced since the day he left the farm in Wisconsin. He was about to turn the manhunt into a war, and he had already selected his first victims. The grit of the prison life, the taste of the mush, the cold of the cell, the weight of the shackles was about to be replaced by the heat of the muzzle flash and the smell of burnt powder. He was ready to reclaim his autonomy regardless of the cost in human lives. The stage was set for June 9th, a date that would be forever etched in the annals of Western crime. June 9th, 1902. The morning air within the limestone confines of the Oregon State Penitentiary was thick with the scent of cedar dust and floor lye. At 7 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron bolts of the cell blocks retracted with a synchronized, mechanical clang that echoed through the tiers. Harry Tracy stepped out of his cell, his movements fluid and devoid of the lethargy that plagued the other inmates after a night on thin mattresses. He wore his standard-issue denim uniform, but beneath the fabric his muscles were coiled with a singular violent intent. He maintained a neutral expression as he joined the line of men shuffling toward the dining hall. for a breakfast of weak coffee and salted mush. To the guards stationed on the galleries, he appeared to be just another number in the machinery of the state. But Tracy was mentally rehearsing the ballistic trajectory of every shot he intended to fire within the hour. By 7:15, the breakfast ritual concluded, and the prisoners were marched toward their respective labor stations. Tracy and David Merrill were assigned to the prison stove foundry and the furniture shop, areas characterized by the roar of furnaces and the high-pitched whine of circular saws. This industrial noise provided the perfect acoustic shroud for their preparations. As they entered the workshop, the smell of raw timber and hot iron met them. Hidden beneath a pile of cedar boards in the corner were 2 Winchester 30-30 rifles and several hundred rounds of ammunition smuggled into the facility weeks prior. Tracy glanced at Merrill, whose face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. He did not offer any words of encouragement. He simply signaled toward the woodpile with a sharp jerk of his chin. The time for planning had expired, and the transition into active combat was imminent. At 7:30, the first act of the massacre occurred. A guard named Frank Farrell, who had been instrumental in the smuggling of the weapons, approached Tracy under the guise of an inspection. Farrell was a man compromised by debt, and as he reached the woodpile, Tracy reached out and retrieved the first Winchester. The cold steel of the receiver felt natural in his hands, a familiar weight that signaled the end of his incarceration. However, Tracy had no intention of leaving witnesses who could identify the source of his weapons. As Farrell turned to lead them toward the side exit, Tracy leveled the rifle and fired a single round into the back of the guard's head. The report of the rifle was a thunderous crack that momentarily silenced the machinery of the shop. Farrell's skull shattered upon impact, sending a spray of bone fragments and gray matter across the fresh cedar planks. The guard collapsed instantly, his body twitching in a brief post-mortem spasm before falling still. The sound of the shot alerted the other guards in the immediate vicinity. Guard S.R.T. Jones, stationed near the center of the workshop, turned in shock toward the muzzle flash, and Tracy fired again without hesitation. The round struck Jones at a distance that offered no mercy, and he collapsed to the floor as the shop erupted into screams, pounding boots, and the metallic clatter of tools kicked aside. High above the workshop floor on a narrow iron catwalk, Guard Frank Gerard tried to bring his rifle to bear on the outlaws. The environment was a chaotic blur of shouting men, drifting dust, and splintering wood. Tracy caught the movement and sent a shot that tore into Gerard's abdomen, dropping him hard. In that instant, lifer Frank Ingram lunged to shield the wounded guard. Merrill fired and shattered Ingram's kneecap, leaving him screaming on the planks, while Tracy and Merrill continued forward through the confusion they had created. At 7:45, the pair reached the yard, where the morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing the stark, whitewashed walls of the penitentiary. The alarm bell was now ringing continuously, a discordant metallic clanging that vibrated through the very ground. Guard Tiffany, perched in a corner tower overlooking the foundry, opened fire with a shotgun. The buckshot whistled through the air around Tracy, shredding the sleeve of his denim shirt but failing to draw blood. Tracy pivoted and fired 3 rapid-focus shots at the tower. One round struck the brickwork, sending a shower of red dust into Tiffany's eyes. The second and third rounds hit the guard in the throat and jaw, respectively. The man slumped over the edge of the tower, his blood raining down onto the gravel path below in a steady, rhythmic drip. The brutality of the situation escalated as the outlaws used 2 guards as human shields to cross the open yard toward the main gate. Hostage B.F. Tiffany was forced ahead of them, his body pressed into the line of fire as bullets snapped past. When another guard tried to stop the escape with a clear shot, Tracy answered by firing through Tiffany's heart. The second hostage dropped and played dead in the dust, and Tracy and Merrill surged on, using the terror they had made as cover. The escape required them to scale the wall near the main gate using a makeshift ladder they had fashioned from leather scraps and iron rungs stolen from the foundry. As Merrill began the ascent, Tracy stood his ground in the center of the yard, acting as a one-man rear guard. He fired with a deliberate rhythmic cadence at any window or door that showed movement. He saw the face of an associate warden in a second-story office and fired a round that shattered the glass in the man's collarbone. The screams of the wounded and the dying filled the enclosure, creating an atmosphere of total carnage. Tracy felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He was not just escaping a prison, he was dismantling the authority that had sought to contain him. He was turning the Salem penitentiary into a slaughterhouse, and he was the head butcher. Once they cleared the top of the 20-foot wall, Tracy and Merrill dropped into the long grass of the outer perimeter. The impact jolted Tracy's previously injured leg, but the surge of adrenaline masked the pain. They did not stop to celebrate. They began a dead run toward the dense timber of the Willamette Valley, which sat 300 yards away. Behind them, the prison was a hive of activity, with guards pouring out of the gates and onto the walls, but the outlaws had already vanished into the thick undergrowth. The transition from the rigid gray world of the cell block to the vibrant, damp green of the Oregon forest was instantaneous and exhilarating. Tracy led the way, his Winchester held across his chest, his eyes already searching for the first sign of a horse or a vehicle they could commandeer. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the pair had reached a small farmstead on the outskirts of Salem. The morning dew was still heavy on the grass, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from the kitchen chimney. Tracy did not hesitate. He kicked in the back door, startling a woman who was preparing breakfast. He ignored her screams, focusing instead on the rifle rack above the fireplace. Finding nothing but an old shotgun, he turned his attention to the stables. He found 2 plow horses, which were slow but sturdy enough for the initial leg of their flight. He forced the woman's husband to help them saddle the animals, threatening to execute the entire family if a single word was spoken to the neighbors. The man complied with trembling hands, his eyes fixed on the bloodstains that still coated Tracy's denim uniform. The environment of the Willamette Valley in June was a labyrinth of deep ferns, towering fir trees, and hidden creek beds. Tracy knew that a massive manhunt would be organized within hours, involving not just the prison guards, but also the local sheriff, the state militia, and hundreds of armed volunteers. He decided to move north toward the rugged terrain of the Columbia River Gorge. He avoided the main roads, sticking to the timberline where the shadows were deepest. The physical reality of the flight began to settle in. The denim uniforms were soaked with sweat and swamp water, and the lack of food began to manifest as a dull ache in their stomachs. Tracy found a patch of wild berries and forced Merrill to eat while they moved, maintaining their pace despite the mounting fatigue. The significance of the Salem prison break cannot be overstated. It was a failure of the state's primary instrument of control, and a direct challenge to the safety of every citizen in the region. The news of the Tracy and Merrill escape spread via telegraph with a speed that bordered on hysteria. Headlines in the Portland and Salem newspapers described the event as a war, and for Tracy, that is exactly what it was. He was no longer a fugitive, he was an insurgent. He had killed 3 guards and wounded several others in the span of 30 minutes, showing a level of lethality and disregard for human life that was unprecedented in the history of the state. He had humanized the horror of his actions by making them personal. He hadn't just fired at uniforms, he had fired at faces. As they rode deeper into the timber at 10 o'clock in the morning, the sound of distant shouting and the barking of dogs reached their ears. The manhunt had begun. Tracy checked the magazine of his Winchester, ensuring a round was chambered. He looked at Merrill, who was slumped in his saddle, his eyes glassed over with shock. Tracy realized that he would likely have to kill Merrill before the chase was over, either because the man would slow him down or because the temptation of a reward would eventually override his fear. But for now, Merrill was another rifle, a secondary source of fire in the ambushes Tracy was already planning. They crossed a shallow stream, the water, cooling the horse's legs, and disappeared into a dense thicket of vine maple. The grit of the morning's events remained on Tracy's skin, the metallic scent of Farrell's blood, the sting of the red brick dust, and the vibration of the Winchester's recoil still humming in his palms. He felt more alive than he had in the 20 months of his incarceration. He viewed the landscape not as a scenic vista, but as a series of tactical assets. Every ridge was a potential sniping post, every ravine a defensive trench. He was a master of the long hunt, and the state of Oregon had just provided him with the largest hunting ground of his career. The brutality he had unleashed at the prison was merely a prologue. The war was only just beginning, and he intended to make the cost of his capture more than the state was willing to pay. At 12 o'clock noon, the pair stopped in a dense grove of Douglas firs to rest the horses. Tracy climbed a tall tree to survey the horizon. He could see dust clouds rising from the roads leading out of Salem, indicating the movement of multiple posses. He noted the directions of their travel and began to formulate a counter-strategy. He would not simply run, he would double back, ambush the pursuers, and use their own equipment against them. He climbed down, his movements agile and predatory. He found Merrill sitting on a log staring at the blood on his own hands. Tracy kicked the log, forcing the man to stand. He told Merrill that the men behind them were not coming to arrest them but to hang them, and that every bullet they had was a second of life they hadn't earned yet. The historical context of the 1902 manhunt was defined by a society that was rapidly modernizing, but still possessed the raw, violent nerves of the frontier. The public's reaction was a mixture of terror and a dark, voyeuristic fascination. Tracy became a folk hero to some and a demon to most, a figure who represented the untamable spirit of the Old West. But for the families of the guards lying in the foundry, there was no folklore. Only the gritty reality of sudden, violent loss. Tracy's standing as an infamous figure was solidified not just by the escape, but by the mechanical efficiency with which he had executed men who were simply performing their jobs. He had stripped away the thin veneer of civilization within the prison walls, and he was now prepared to do the same to the entire Pacific Northwest. As the afternoon shadows lengthened at 4 o'clock, the outlaws moved into the foothills of the Cascades. The terrain became steeper and the air cooler, the scent of pine needles replacing the stagnant smell of the valley. Tracy's mind was a map of contingencies. He considered the possibility of reaching the coast, but he knew the ports would be watched. He decided instead to loop back toward the Seattle area, betting that the sheer audacity of moving toward a major population center would confuse the trackers. He was a ghost in the timber, a shadow with a Winchester, and the manhunt was about to turn into a war of attrition that would leave a trail of bodies across 2 states. The physical details of the next several days would involve a series of running gunfights and narrow escapes that would further cement Tracy's reputation for invincibility. But for the moment, as the sun began to set on June 9, 1902, the primary reality was the silence of the forest and the cold weight of the rifle in his hands. He was free, and the price of that freedom was the blood that had been spilled in the Salem foundry. He did not regret a single shot. He was Harry Tracy, and he had turned his back on the cage forever. The war had begun, and he was the only one who knew the rules. This was the moment Tracy moved from being a criminal to a legend of horror, and the state of Oregon would never be the same. Tracy's leadership over Merrill during this initial phase was a study in psychological domination. He used Merrill's fear as a leash, keeping the man focused on the immediate task of survival. He knew that Merrill was a liability, but he also knew that a cornered animal is a dangerous one, and he intended to use that danger to his advantage. As they made camp that first night, Tracy sat with his back against a tree, his rifle across his lap, watching the flickering shadows of the forest. He did not sleep. He was waiting for the first sign of the enemy, his ears tuned to the slightest crack of a twig. He was the master of the manhunt, and he was ready for the next move. The transition from the prison break to the manhunt was a shift in the scale of the violence, but not its nature. The same cold calculation that had guided Tracy's hand in the foundry would now guide him through the forests of the Northwest. He was a man who had completely embraced the predator within, and the world was his killing ground. The significance of his stand at the prison was that it proved no cage could hold him, and no law could restrain him. He was a force of nature as indifferent and lethal as the storms that lashed the Oregon coast. The war was on, and Harry Tracy was just getting started. June 10th, 1902. The dawn light filtered through a ceiling of dense Douglas fir and western hemlock, casting long, fractured shadows across the forest floor where Harry Tracy and David Merrill lay concealed. The ground was a sponge of decaying needles and damp moss that held the moisture of the previous night's rain, soaking into the denim of their prison uniforms until the fabric felt like a second, colder skin. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Tracy sat upright, his back pressed against the rough, furrowed bark of a cedar tree. He did not move with the stiffness of a man who had slept on the earth. His body remained an instrument of constant readiness. He spent the first minutes of the day inspecting the action of his Winchester, ensuring that the moisture of the valley had not fouled the mechanical slide or the firing pin. He watched Merrill, who was still deep in a heavy, erratic sleep, his chest heaving with the labor of a man whose nerves were beginning to fray under the pressure of the pursuit. The environment of the Willamette Valley was a tactical maze that Tracy intended to use as a weapon against the approaching posses. By 6 o'clock in the morning, the sound of steam whistles from Salem reached their position, signaling the mobilization of the state militia and the local deputies. Tracy knew that the authorities would expect them to flee toward the coast or south toward California. Instead, he directed Merrill to prepare for a northern movement that would skirt the edges of the populated settlements. They possessed no food beyond a few scraps of dry bread stolen from a farmhouse the previous evening, and their water source was the runoff from the frequent rain showers that gathered in the broad leaves of the ferns. Tracy's physical state remained disciplined, his mind focused on the caloric requirements of his muscles and the necessity of maintaining a high rate of travel through the underbrush. At 8 o'clock in the morning, they encountered their first significant obstacle, the Pudding River. The water was swollen from the spring rains, moving in a murky, silt-heavy torrent that carried debris and downed timber. Tracy scouted the bank for 300 yards until he found a section where a massive hemlock had fallen across the span. He forced Merrill to cross first, watching the man's boots slip on the wet bark. Tracy followed with the Winchester slung across his back, his center of gravity low and his eyes fixed on the opposite bank. Once across, they entered a region of dense vine, maple, and blackberry thickets that tore at their hands and faces, leaving a trail of minute blood droplets on the foliage. Tracy viewed these injuries as a necessary cost of concealment, though he was careful to avoid leaving larger signs of their passage that a skilled tracker could exploit. The first ambush occurred at 10 o'clock and 30 minutes in the morning. A posse of 8 men led by a deputy sheriff from Marion County had managed to pick up their scent near a small orchard. The lawmen were moving with a lack of caution that Tracy found insulting. They were talking in loud tones and allowing their horses to neigh. Tracy signaled for Merrill to drop behind a rotted log while he climbed a small rise overlooking the trail. He waited until the lead rider was within 50 yards. The man was wearing a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a shotgun across his saddle horn. Tracy sighted on the man's chest and fired. The round punched through the deputy's ribcage, the impact unseating him and sending him crashing into the mud. Before the other riders could react, Tracy fired 3 more rounds in rapid succession, hitting a second man in the shoulder and striking the horse of a third, causing the animal to rear and throw its rider into a thicket of thorns. The brutality of the exchange was brief and decisive. The remaining members of the posse scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the timber, their bullets thudding harmlessly into the trunks of the fir trees. Tracy did not stay to engage in a prolonged firefight. He utilized the confusion to circle around the rear of the posse's position, moving through the brush with the silence of a predator. He reached the tethered horses of the lawmen and began to slash the cinches of their saddles with his knife. He took the 2 strongest mounts, a bay and a chestnut, and signaled for Merrill to join him. By the time the deputies realized the outlaws were no longer on the ridge, Tracy and Merrill were galloping north, leaving the wounded men behind in the mud. This successful engagement reinforced Tracy's belief that the disorganized volunteers of the valley were no match for a man who viewed the manhunt as a formal theater of war. By 12 o'clock noon, the rain had returned, a steady gray drizzle that limited visibility to less than 50 yards. This weather was a strategic asset as it washed away their tracks and dampened the sound of their horses' hooves. Tracy led them into a deep ravine where the canopy was so thick that the ground remained relatively dry. They stopped to inspect the saddlebags of the stolen horses, finding a supply of salted beef, several boxes of ammunition, and a flask of whiskey. Tracy allowed Merrill a single swallow of the liquor before taking the flask and pouring the rest into a small wound on his own leg to prevent infection. He ate the beef with a slow, deliberate mastication, ensuring his stomach did not cramp from the sudden intake of protein. His eyes never left the opening of the ravine, his ears tuned to the rhythmic patter of the rain and the distant muffled sounds of the world he had rejected. The significance of these initial skirmishes lay in the psychological toll they exerted on the civilian population. As news of the ambush reached the nearby towns via the telegraph lines, a state of near hysteria began to take hold. People who had previously viewed the escape as a distant legal matter now shuttered their windows and armed themselves with whatever implements they possessed. Tracy was aware of this fear and intended to exacerbate it. He saw the social order of Oregon as a fragile construct that could be shattered by the consistent application of unpredictable violence. He did not view himself as a criminal seeking a payday. He was a man proving that the state's promise of security was a lie. Each time he outmaneuvered a posse, he was tearing a hole in the fabric of the 20th century. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the pair reached a logging camp near the foothills of the Cascades. The camp was nearly empty as most of the men had joined the search for the outlaws or fled to the safety of the larger towns. Tracy found a lone cook in the mess hall, a man in his 60s who stood frozen with a large kitchen knife in his hand. Tracy did not fire his rifle. He walked up to the man and calmly took the knife from his grip, then ordered him to produce every loaf of bread and every tin of coffee in the larder. While Merrill packed the supplies, Tracy questioned the cook about the movements of the state militia. He learned that several companies had been deployed to guard the bridges over the Columbia River. This information confirmed Tracy's plan to stay in the high timber, navigating the ridges rather than the valley floors where the military could utilize their superior numbers. The environment of the high timber was a landscape of jagged basalt and ancient growth, where the air was thinner and the temperature remained 10 degrees lower than the valley. As 4 o'clock arrived, they began a steep ascent, the horses struggling for footing on the slick rock. Tracy's denim uniform was now a tattered wreck, the knees worn through and the sleeves stained with the grease of the stolen meat and the blood of his earlier injuries. He felt a sense of clarity in the physical hardship. The grit of the trail, the grit in his teeth, the grit under his fingernails, and the raw friction of the saddle against his thighs was a familiar reality that he preferred over the artificial cleanliness of the prison. He was becoming a part of the topography, a lethal extension of the wilderness that the city-dwelling lawmen could not comprehend. The second major encounter of the day occurred at 6 o'clock in the evening near a geographic feature known as the Devil's Backbone. A group of 4 armed ranchers had established a picket line across a narrow pass, hoping to intercept any movement toward the north. They had constructed a small breastwork of stones and logs, appearing prepared for a siege. Tracy observed them from a distance of 400 yards. He realized that a frontal assault would be a waste of ammunition. He instructed Merrill to stay with the horses and fire a single shot every 5 minutes to keep the ranchers' attention fixed on the trail. Tracy then began a grueling traverse of the vertical rock face to the east, his fingers bleeding as he gripped the sharp edges of the basalt. He moved above the ranchers' position, looking down into their fortification. The brutality of what followed was a testament to Tracy's efficiency. He fired from the high ground, his first round striking a rancher in the top of the skull, the projectile exiting through the jaw. The man fell across the stone wall without making a sound. The other 3 men panicked, realizing they were being fired upon from a vertical angle they had not accounted for. Tracy fired again, hitting a second man in the spine, paralyzing him instantly. The remaining 2 ranchers abandoned their position and fled down the slope, leaving their rifles and their wounded comrade behind. Tracy descended into the breastwork where the paralyzed man lay gasping, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended physical pain. Tracy did not offer any comfort. He took the men's ammunition and their canteens, then moved back toward Merrill. He did not kill the wounded man, leaving him as a burden for the next group of pursuers to find and transport. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the light had faded to a deep, bruised purple. The outlaws found a small cave behind a waterfall, where the sound of the crashing water provided an acoustic barrier against any approaching footsteps. Tracy allowed a small fire to be built deep within the cavern using dry heartwood that produced very little smoke. They dried their clothes as best they could, the steam rising from the wet wool in thick, pungent clouds. Tracy sat by the flames, his face illuminated by the orange glow, looking like a figure carved from the very stone of the mountain. He spent the night hours mapping out the next phase of the journey. He knew that the Columbia River remained the primary obstacle. Crossing it would require more than just a horse. It would require a boat and a distraction that would pull the militia away from the primary, ferries. The significance of the day's events was the realization by the authorities that Harry Tracy was not merely running. He was hunting. The 2 ambushes had left 2 men dead and 3 wounded, and the outlaws remained better armed and better mounted than they had been at dawn. The newspapers in Portland were already printing special editions with headlines about the demon of the woods, fueling a public panic that made the work of the lawmen even more difficult. Every shadow in the forest was now a potential killer, and every snapped twig was a signal of doom. Tracy relished this reputation. He understood that fear was a force multiplier, a tool that made a dozen men act like one, and one man act like 100. He was not just a man with a Winchester. He was a psychological infection that was spreading through the state of Oregon. As 9 o'clock in the evening arrived, the silence of the cave was punctuated only by the drip of water and the crackle of the small fire. Merrill was already asleep, his snores echoing against the stone walls. Tracy remained awake, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. He reflected on the path he had taken since the Salem foundry. He felt no remorse for the men he had killed that day. To him, they were merely obstacles in a mechanical process, no different from the stones he had broken in the prison yard. He was a creature of pure survival. A man who had stripped away every layer of social conditioning until only the bone and the instinct remained. The war he was waging was not about a cause or a grievance. It was about the fundamental right of a predator to move through the world without a cage. The grit of his existence, the metallic taste of the water, the smell of the damp earth, and the constant dull throb of his healing leg was the only truth he acknowledged. He knew that the next day would bring more violence, more fatigue, and more blood. He welcomed it. The manhunt was the only environment where he felt truly at home, a place where the rules of civilization were suspended and the only law was the accuracy of a copper-jacketed projectile. As the fire died down to a bed of glowing embers at 11 o'clock at night, Tracy finally closed his eyes, though his ears remained open to the voice of the mountain. He was Harry Tracy, and the state of Oregon was about to learn that the woods did not belong to the law. The historical context of the 1902 manhunt was also a story of the limits of technology. The telegraph could spread the news of a crime, but it could not catch a man in a vine maple thicket. The railroad could move troops, but it could not navigate a basalt ridge. Tracy was exploiting the gap between the modern world and the ancient landscape, a gap that he occupied with lethal proficiency. He was a ghost in the gears of the state, a haunting reminder that the frontier was not as dead as the politicians in Salem liked to claim. The brutality of his journey was a mirror of the brutality of the land itself, a place that offered no mercy to the weak or the unprepared. By 2 o'clock in the morning on June 11th, the rain had ceased, and a cold mist settled over the valley floor far below. Tracy woke without a start, his senses immediately returning to a state of high alert. He kicked the sleeping Merrill, signaling that it was time to move. They extinguished the embers of the fire and moved out of the cave, their silhouettes blending into the gray pre-dawn light. The journey toward the Columbia River would be the most dangerous leg of the trip so far, requiring them to descend from the safety of the ridges and interact with the settlements along the water. Tracy was ready. He checked the ammunition count in his belt, feeling the heavy, cold weight of the brass cartridges. He was a man who had turned the manhunt into a war, and he had no intention of losing. Each crossing of a swollen river, each climb up a basalt face, and each shot fired in an ambush was a step in the evolution of Harry Tracy from a fugitive to a force of nature. This was the moment the state of Oregon realized it was not chasing a man but a catastrophe that moved on two legs. Tracy's interaction with the landscape was not one of appreciation but of utilization. He did not see the beauty of the Douglas firs. He saw the thickness of their trunks as cover. He did not see the grandeur of the waterfall. He saw the acoustic shadow it provided. This clinical approach to his surroundings was what allowed him to survive where others would have perished. He was a technician of the wilderness, a man who had translated the violence of his youth into a sophisticated system of frontier warfare. As he led the horses down the northern slope toward the river at 4 o'clock in the morning, he was a man in full possession of his lethal capabilities. The significance of the Devil's Backbone skirmish was that it proved Tracy could win even when the enemy had a prepared defensive position. It shattered the morale of the local volunteers, many of whom began to desert the posses and return to their farms, unwilling to face a man who could scale a vertical cliff to deliver a killing shot. The manhunt was becoming a vacuum as the authorities struggled to find men willing to step into the killing ground Tracy had created. This vacuum was exactly what Tracy needed to reach the river and the next theater of his war. He was Harry Tracy, and the legend of his invincibility was being written in the blood of those who tried to stop him. As the sun began to rise on June 11th, 1902, the first light touched the peaks of the Cascades, turning the snow to a brilliant, heartless white. Tracy looked toward the north, where the great river lay hidden in the fog. He felt a surge of cold energy. The chase was his life, and the blood was his currency. He moved forward into the mist, the Winchester held firm in his hand, ready for whatever the new day would bring. The war continued, and the cost was rising with every mile. The grit and brutality of the day had left him exhausted but exhilarated. He had killed men who represented the law. He had stolen their horses, and he had outclimbed the very rock of the earth. He was more than a man. He was a manifestation of the violent past that refused to stay buried. The Manhunt was his masterpiece, a work of art written in cordite and copper. As he reached the lower foothills at 5 o'clock in the morning, he saw the first lights of a small riverside settlement. The next phase was beginning, and the world was watching in terror. July 3rd, 1902. The morning fog hung low over the river bottoms north of Seattle, a cold gray skin that clung to alder trunks and wet undergrowth along the Bothell Road. Harry Tracy moved through the timber with his Winchester held tight against his chest, alone now, after shooting David Merrill near Chehalis on June 28th. He had slipped across the Columbia River days earlier and threaded his way toward King County, where the manhunt had swollen into hundreds of deputies, police, and armed volunteers. Tracy did not treat their numbers as protection. He treated them as noise, as confusion, as a mass he could break apart with fear and precision. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the silence of the Bothell woods broke under the thud of hooves and the metallic jingle of harness. A posse moved along the Bothell-Seattle Road, among them Deputy Sheriff Jack Williams and Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond, pushing forward through damp brush and scattered cordwood. Tracy had chosen his ground, a slight rise where a fallen fir made a natural breastwork. He settled behind it, steadying his rifle, and watched the badges glint as the lead men entered a clearing. The Battle of Bothell commenced at 8 o'clock and 15 minutes. Tracy fired first, the Winchester cracking through the timber like a hammer on iron. The round struck Deputy Sheriff Charles Raymond and dropped him from the saddle into the mud. Williams tried to bring his revolver up, but Tracy worked the lever with mechanical precision and sent another shot that tore into the deputy, leaving him wounded and unable to press forward. The rest of the posse scattered for cover behind cordwood and stumps, bullets snapping and thudding into trunks as panic replaced formation. The brutality intensified as Tracy advanced on the pinned-down men in a low, fast crouch, using the massive trunks as shields. From within 30 yards, he fired again through a gap in the cordwood. The shot struck Possum Cornelius Rowley in the face, and he went down hard in the mud, fatally wounded. The surviving lawmen, seeing two men hit in moments and their line unraveling, broke and fled back toward Bothell. Tracy did not chase. He stripped ammunition, took what he wanted, and vanished back into the timber as if the gunfire had been nothing more than a chore. By 10 o'clock in the morning, the news of the Bothell ambush had reached the city of Seattle via the telegraph. A state of absolute panic gripped the urban center. The Seattle Daily Times printed an extra edition with the headline, "Tracy the Terrible," and the city council ordered the closing of all saloons and public gathering places. The environment of Seattle turned into a fortress of fear. Citizens barricaded their doors and business owners stood in front of their shops with shotguns. Tracy, however, did not flee into the mountains. In a move of incredible audacity, he headed toward the outskirts of the city, intending to use the populated areas for cover and supplies. He understood that a massive posse would be looking for him in the deep woods, and by moving toward the city, he was moving into their blind spot. At 12 o'clock noon, Tracy reached a small farmhouse owned by a family named Van Horn on the northern edge of Seattle. He entered through the back door with the rifle at his hip and ordered a meal, fried chicken, fresh coffee, whatever was hot and fast. He spoke to Mrs. Van Horn with the calm of a common traveler, asking about soil and roads while he watched the windows. Afterward, he forced the husband to cut his hair and provide a clean suit, turning a ragged fugitive into a man who could slip through streets without drawing a second glance. The significance of the Siege of Seattle was the psychological domination Tracy exerted over a major American city. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, while the police were searching the ravines of Bothell, Tracy was walking through the suburban streets of Fremont. He encountered a local man named John Johns and engaged him in a conversation about the best route to the waterfront. Johns, unaware of the identity of the man in the clean suit, provided the information. Tracy thanked him and then casually informed him that he had just spoken to Harry Tracy. The man stood paralyzed as Tracy walked away, the weight of the information sinking in like a physical blow. This behavior created a sense of omnipresence. Tracy could be anywhere, anyone, and the city's defenses were essentially useless against a man who did not fear the daylight. The physical reality of the flight grew more grueling as the day progressed. The clean suit was quickly ruined by rain and mud as Tracy moved through thickets and backlots, staying off the main roads and using fences and hedges as cover. He carried no partner now, only the memory of Merrill and the betrayal that had followed them out of the prison yard. Tracy's mind stayed cold and tactical, measuring distance and angles, listening for whistles and reading the city-like terrain. The killing of David Merrill had already occurred on June 28, 1902, near Chehalis. Tracy confronted him with what he had learned, then challenged him to a duel, 10 paces, turn and shoot. Merrill counted the steps, tense and desperate, and on the 8th step, Tracy turned early and shot him in the back. As Merrill spun, Tracy drove another round into his side, then closed in and fired again into his skull. The body lay hidden until it was discovered a month later by Mary Wagoner and her son George while they were out picking blackberries. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Tracy resurfaced at the home of a man named Gehrig in the South Park district of Seattle. He held the family hostage for several hours, forcing them to provide him with a fresh horse and a supply of canned goods. He spent the time cleaning his rifle and listening to the city's alarm whistles, which continued to blow at irregular intervals. The grit of the situation was evident in the way Tracy moved. His eyes were sunken and red-rimmed from lack of sleep, and his hands were stained with a mixture of Merrill's blood and the black powder residue of the day's gunfights. He possessed a level of functional endurance that seemed to transcend the limits of the human body. He told the Gehrig family that he intended to leave a trail of blood from Seattle to the Idaho border, if the law did not leave him alone. The environment of Seattle at 8 o'clock in the evening was one of total darkness, as the city had ordered the streetlights extinguished to prevent Tracy from seeing his targets. This tactic backfired, as it also prevented the police from seeing Tracy. He utilized the darkness to move through the backyards and alleys of the city, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the militia patrols were most frequent. He encountered a lone sentry near a bridge over the Duwamish River and struck the man over the head with the butt of his Winchester, knocking him unconscious before the man could sound his whistle. Tracy crossed the bridge and began a long, solitary ride toward the east, heading for the foothills of the Cascades. He was leaving the city behind, but the terror he had instilled would remain for weeks. The historical context of the 1902 siege was defined by the transition of the Pacific Northwest from a frontier to an industrial society. Tracy was a violent reminder that the old, lawless ways were not easily erased. His ability to paralyze a city of 80,000 people with a single rifle and a lack of remorse was a testament to the power of individual terror. The authorities in Seattle were humiliated by their inability to capture a man who was operating within their own city limits. The governor of Washington offered a reward of several $1,000s for Tracy's head, dead or alive, and the manhunt grew to include over 300 men, making it one of the largest in the history of the United States. By 10 o'clock in the evening, Tracy had reached the outskirts of Renton. The rain had turned into a heavy downpour, the water cascading off the brim of his stolen hat and soaking into his collar. He found a small, dry cave in a sandstone outcropping and stopped to rest his horse. He sat in the darkness, the only sound the rhythmic dripping of water and the grinding of the horse's teeth as it chewed on a handful of stolen grain. He felt no grief for Merrill, and no fear of the hundreds of men hunting him. He felt only a cold, clinical curiosity about the next day's tactical challenges. He checked the round in the chamber of his Winchester, the metallic click a comforting sound in the silence of the night. He was the master of the long ride, and the mountains were his territory. The brutality of the Bothell fight and the cold-blooded execution of Merrill had solidified Tracy's reputation as a man beyond redemption. He was no longer seen as a person, but as a predatory animal that needed to be exterminated. This perception suited Tracy. He had no desire for human connection or social standing. He only desired the freedom to move and the power to kill those who tried to stop him. The grit of his existence, the taste of the cold rain, the smell of the damp earth, and the weight of the steel in his hands was the only reality he acknowledged. He was Harry Tracy, and he had turned the state of Washington into a war zone. As the clock struck midnight at the end of July 3rd, 1902, the city of Seattle remained in a state of siege. The newspapers screamed headlines about the Bothell massacre, and the Seattle Times printed extra editions that were hawked on street corners by boys with horse-frightened voices. The wealthy families of Queen Anne Hill barred their doors and loaded their shotguns, while the working men of Fremont and Ballard formed impromptu patrols with clubs and rifles. Tracy had become more than a criminal. He had become a nightmare given flesh, and the fear was contagious. The significance of the day's events lay in the total failure of organized law enforcement to contain a single determined individual. Tracy had outfought a posse, outthought a city's police force, and eliminated his only partner without a moment's hesitation. He was a force of nature, moving with a purpose that the law could not grasp. The historical record of the Pacific Northwest would forever contain the story of the summer of 1902, when a lone outlaw turned the manhunt into a war and the cities into cages of fear. The grit and the blood of Bothell and Seattle were merely the latest entries in a ledger of violence that Harry Tracy was writing across the map of the West. Each interaction with a hostage family, each shot fired in the Bothell timber, and each step through the Seattle mud was a deliberate move in a larger game of survival. This was the peak of Tracy's power, a moment when he truly believed he was invincible. Tracy's leadership, now directed only at himself, was a study in absolute self-discipline. He managed his caloric intake, his ammunition, and his physical energy with the precision of a military commander. He knew that the Cascades would be a test of his endurance, and he was already mentally mapping the trails and passes he would use. He viewed the mountain range not as an obstacle, but as a defensive fortification that would filter out the weaker members of the posse. Only the most determined and skilled trackers would follow him into the high country, and those were the men he looked forward to meeting in the sights of his rifle. By 4 o'clock in the morning on July 4th, the mist began to lift. The first rays of sun cut through the cloud cover and illuminated the battered landscape of the shooting. Tracy emerged from the shadowed edge of the woods and forced his way into a small settlement near Renton, ordering food and demanding fresh horses. He did not speak like a cornered animal. He spoke like a man issuing commands from a position of power, and the terrified residents obeyed. By dawn, he was moving again, heading east toward the Cascades, leaving the trembling city behind him and dragging the entire region into the next phase of the hunt. As he rode into the first light of the new day, Tracy felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He had survived the first month of the manhunt. He had humiliated the authorities in 2 states, and he was still better armed and better mounted than when he began. The war continued, and the stakes were rising with every mile. He was Harry Tracy, and the manhunt was his only home. The grit of the road was his bread, and the blood of his enemies was his wine. He pushed the horse into a steady trot, the animal's hooves making a rhythmic, muffled sound on the damp forest floor. The next chapter of the war was about to begin. July 5th, 1902. The ascent into the jagged, basalt-crowned ridges of the Cascade Mountains began at 4 o'clock in the morning, with Harry Tracy leading a stolen pack horse through a vertical labyrinth of vine maple and ancient hemlock. The air at this elevation was stripped of the Puget Sound's humidity, replaced by a thin, biting chill that smelled of old snow and volcanic dust. Tracy's physical condition was a testament to extreme functional endurance. His frame had leaned down to wire and bone, and his skin had weathered to a dark, permanent bronze. He possessed a level of mental clarity that bordered on the clinical, his thoughts occupied entirely by the mechanical requirements of the climb and the ballistic potential of the terrain. He avoided the established mountain passes such as Snoqualmie, knowing that the state militia had already established blockades with Gatling guns and reinforced telegraph stations. Instead, he chose a route through the trackless timber of the high country, where the sheer verticality of the slopes acted as a filter against the less determined members of the Washington posse. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the temperature had dropped as they reached the edge of a subalpine meadow. The ground was a mixture of granite scree and patches of frozen mud that crunched under the horse's hooves. Tracy stopped to rest the animals, his hand resting on the receiver of his Winchester. He scanned the horizon toward the west, where the distant hazy lowlands of the Seattle Basin were being scoured by hundreds of armed men. He felt no sense of relief in the distance he had covered. He only saw the landscape as a series of defensive tiers. He spent 30 minutes checking the shoes of his mounts, using a heavy hunting knife to pry stones from their frogs. Any lameness in the horses would result in his immediate death, a reality he managed with the same cold detachment he applied to his ammunition counts. He consumed a handful of raw oats and a piece of dried venison, the calories providing a slow burn of energy for the grueling miles ahead. The environment of the high Cascades in July was a theater of extreme contrasts. While the valleys below sweltered in the summer heat, the ridges were subjected to sudden, violent shifts in weather. At 10 o'clock and 15 minutes in the morning, a localized squall of sleet hammered against the granite peaks, reducing visibility to less than 20 yards. Tracy did not seek shelter. He utilized the storm as a sensory shroud, moving through the gray blur with the confidence of a man who had memorized the cardinal directions. He navigated by the lean of the trees and the density of the moss on the north-facing rocks. His clothing, a mixture of stolen wool and denim, was encrusted with a layer of frozen salt and dirt, but his internal temperature remained regulated by constant physical exertion. He was moving away from the industrial civilization of the coast and back into the raw, unrefined West, where he was the apex predator. At 12 o'clock noon, Tracy began the descent toward the eastern slopes of the range. The transition from the damp fir forests of the west to the dry ponderosa pine belts of the east was marked by a shift in the acoustic quality of the woods. The sound of his travel became sharper, the snap of dry needles and the clatter of loose stone echoing further through the thinning air. He encountered a small line shack used by forest rangers near the Clay Elam River. The cabin was empty, but Tracy found a cache of canned peaches and a sack of flour. He did not build a fire. He ate the fruit directly from the tin using his knife, the syrup providing a much-needed spike in glucose. He then systematically destroyed the remaining supplies he could not carry, ensuring that any pursuing scouts would find nothing but empty shelves and floorboards stained with brine. He was waging a scorched earth campaign against his own shadow. The first human interaction on the eastern side of the mountains occurred at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on July 7th. Tracy reached a remote ranch owned by the Saunders family. He did not approach with stealth. He rode directly into the yard, his Winchester held across the pommel of his saddle. The Saunders men were away assisting with the search, leaving only the women and a young boy to manage the stock. Tracy ordered them into the kitchen and demanded a hot meal. As they worked, he sat in a wooden chair with his back to the wall, watching the road through a gap in the curtains. He spoke very little, but when he did, his voice was a low, resonant drone that commanded absolute obedience. He instructed the boy to groom and feed his horses, threatening to shoot the family's prize milk cow if the work was not done to his satisfaction. The grit of the situation was the palpable terror of the family who watched the bloodstains on Tracy's sleeves and the cold, unblinking focus of his eyes as he methodically cleaned the carbon from his rifle's bolt. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Tracy had finished his meal and prepared to move. He did not pay for the food, but he left the family with a chilling warning. He told them that if they signaled any posse within the next 12 hours, he would return and burn every structure on the property to the ground. This was not an idle boast. Tracy had already proven his willingness to commit arson to cover his tracks. He took a fresh supply of blankets and a heavy canvas slicker from the ranch's mudroom, further refining his equipment for the high plateau country. As he rode east, he felt the first dry gusts of wind from the Columbia Basin, a heat that felt like an oven door opening against his face. He was entering the wheat country of Lincoln County, a landscape of rolling hills and deep coulees that offered a different kind of tactical challenge. The significance of Tracy's trek across the Cascades was the total failure of the military cordons to intercept him. The governor of Washington had expected the mountains to act as a natural prison, yet Tracy had treated the range as a highway. The newspapers in Wenatchee and Yakima were now reporting sightings of the specter of the peaks, and the bounty on his head had been increased again. Tracy enjoyed the reports, occasionally leaving a copy of a newspaper at his campsites with his initials carved into the nearby trees. He was playing a psychological game with the entire state, proving that the modern infrastructure of the 1902 government was unable to track a single man who understood the mechanics of the wild. He was humanized only by his physical needs, hunger, thirst, and fatigue, but his response to those needs was entirely mechanical and devoid of emotion. At 6 o'clock in the evening, Tracy reached the banks of the Columbia River for the second time in a month, this time much further north, near the town of Wenatchee. The river here was a deep, green power that carved through the basalt with a relentless force. He avoided the ferry crossings and the bridges, instead scouting for a private ranch with access to the water. He found a small orchard property where a rowboat was tethered to a willow tree. He forced the owner, a man named Johnson, to row him across at gunpoint. The crossing was perilous, the small craft buffeted by the eddies and the weight of the horses swimming behind the stern. Tracy sat in the back, his rifle leveled at the rower's head, his eyes scanning the opposite bank for the glint of a deputy's badge. When they reached the eastern shore, Tracy did not kill the man. He simply tied him to a tree with enough slack to be found by his family later that evening, and then vanished into the sagebrush. The environment of eastern Washington was a vast open theater of yellow wheat and red dust. By 8 o'clock in the evening on July 8th, Tracy was moving through the outskirts of the Big Bend country. The visibility here was miles in every direction, which meant he could see pursuers from a distance, but it also meant he was vulnerable to long-range rifle fire. He adjusted his tactics, moving primarily during the twilight hours of dawn and dusk, and staying in the deep shadows of the coulees during the midday heat. He became a master of dust reading, watching the horizon for the telltale plumes of a riding posse. If he saw dust, he would change his heading by 90 degrees and move at a gallop until he found a rock formation to hide the horse. His existence was a constant cycle of observation and movement, a life reduced to the physics of evasion. The brutality of the journey manifested in the physical degradation of his mounts. The horses' legs were scarred from the basalt of the mountains, and their coats were matted with a mixture of salt and alkali dust. Tracy showed them no mercy, pushing them until their breath came, in wet, rattling gasps. When a horse failed, he simply rode to the nearest homestead and took another, often at the cost of a confrontation with the owner. During one such incident on July 9th, a rancher attempted to defend his stable with a pitchfork. Tracy did not hesitate. He fired a round from his revolver that struck the man in the thigh, the projectile shattering the bone and leaving the man screaming in the dirt. Tracy took the horse, saddled it with practiced speed, and was gone before the man's family could reach the yard. This was the gritty reality of the manhunt, a trail of broken men and stolen property that stretched for hundreds of miles. By 10 o'clock in the evening on July 10th, Tracy reached the basalt cliffs overlooking the Grand Coulee. The scale of the landscape was immense, a relic of ancient floods that dwarfed the petty concerns of the lawmen hunting him. He made camp in a shallow cave, his only company the sound of the wind whistling through the dry sage. He spent the night hours performing maintenance on his equipment. He used a piece of oiled rag to clean the internal magazine of the Winchester, ensuring the spring was free of grit. He also counted his remaining cartridges, 64 rounds for the rifle and 38 for the revolvers. He knew that the final confrontation was approaching. The density of the settlements was increasing as he moved toward the railheads, and the local sheriffs were becoming more coordinated in their efforts to trap him in the open wheat fields. The historical context of the Lincoln County area in 1902 was one of a burgeoning agricultural empire. The farmers here were hard-working religious people who viewed Tracy as a literal manifestation of the devil. They organized telephone passes using the new rural lines to report his position from one farm to the next. Tracy was aware of this and began to cut the wires whenever he crossed a road, a tactic that delayed the reports by several hours. He also began to use the families he held hostage as sources of information, forcing them to call their neighbors and ask about the location of the deputies. He was a pioneer in the use of psychological warfare against a civilian population, turning their own technology and social connections against them. At 12 o'clock midnight, Tracy sat by a small, smokeless fire made of dried cow chips. The orange light flickered across his gaunt features, making him look like a ghost of the 19th century hauntings. He reflected on the death of David Merrill, a moment that felt like a lifetime ago. He felt no regret for the act. He only felt the weight of the ammunition he had gained from his former partner's body. He was a man who had successfully purged himself of all social obligations, living in a state of pure, unadulterated autonomy. He knew that the end would likely come in a field of wheat or a dusty street. But he intended to make the state of Washington pay for every inch of his freedom with the blood of its representatives. Each mile covered, each farmstead raided, and each night spent in the cold dust was a testament to Tracy's singular will. By 2 o'clock in the morning on July 11th, Tracy woke and prepared to move again. His body was a machine that required very little sleep, a byproduct of years of fugitive existence. He saddled his horse with fingers that were numb from the morning frost, his movements silent and efficient. He looked toward the east, where the first hint of light was beginning to touch the horizon. He knew that the town of Creston lay ahead, and with it, the final act of his war. He checked the action of his Winchester one last time, the metallic click sounding like a period at the end of a sentence. He was Harry Tracy, and the manhunt was entering its final, most violent phase. The grit of the trail was now a part of his very being. The dust of the Big Bend was in his lungs, and the salt of the Cascades was in his pores. He was the embodiment of the violent frontier, a man who had turned the act of running into a form of combat. As he rode toward the sunrise, he felt a sense of grim satisfaction. He had survived longer than anyone expected, and he had done so on his own terms. The brutality of his journey was a mirror of the world he lived in, a world of hard edges and sudden death. He pushed the horse into a steady trot, the animal's hooves making a muffled, rhythmic sound in the dry grass. At 4 o'clock in the morning, Tracy reached a small creek and stopped to let the horse drink. He washed his face in the cold water, the shock of it clearing the last of the sleep from his mind. He looked at his reflection in the surface of the pool, seeing a man he barely recognized. The eyes were the only thing that remained the same, cold, blue, and utterly determined. He was no longer Harry Severns. He was the monster that the newspapers had created, and he was ready to fulfill the role. He turned his mount away from the water and headed into the rolling hills of Lincoln County, where the wheat was tall and the end was waiting. The transition into the final chapter of his life was marked by a sense of inevitability. He knew that the resources of the state were finally converging on his position. The telegraph lines he had cut were being repaired, and the posses were narrowing their circles. He did not fear the end. He only feared the possibility of being taken alive again. He checked the revolver tucked into his waistband, ensuring the cylinder was full. If the rifle failed him, the revolver would be the final arbiter of his fate. He was a man who had lived by the gun, and he was more than prepared to die by it. The historical significance of the 1902 manhunt was reaching its climax. The event had captivated the nation, a final bloody gasp of the Old West in the midst of the new century. Tracy was the central figure in this drama, a man who had successfully resisted the entire apparatus of the state for over 60 days. His journey from the Salem foundry to the Creston wheat fields was a map of human endurance and lethal capability. As he rode through the morning mist, he was a legend in the making, a story that would be told for generations to describe the day the manhunt turned into a war. The final mile of the morning was a slow, cautious advance. Tracy utilized every fold in the ground and every stand of brush to hide his approach. He was a predator in his element, moving with a grace that was both beautiful and terrifying. He reached the edge of a high plateau and looked down at the valley below, where the lights of a small town were beginning to flicker out as the sun rose. This was the territory of his final stand. He took a deep breath of the dry eastern air and began the descent. The war was coming to a close, and Harry Tracy was ready for the final shot. August 6, 1902. The morning sun rose over the rolling basalt coulees of Lincoln County, casting a harsh, flat light across the expansive wheat fields of eastern Washington. Harry Tracy sat atop a weary, lathered bay horse on a ridge overlooking the town of Creston, his eyes scanning the horizon with the mechanical precision of a rangefinder. It was just under 2 months since the slaughter at the Salem foundry, and the physical toll of 60 days of constant pursuit was etched into every line of his gaunt, weathered face. His clothing was a collection of tattered, salt-stained rags held together by grime and determination, and his weight had dropped to a point where his cheekbones appeared as sharp as the flint he had navigated in the high desert. He possessed 64 rounds of ammunition for his Winchester, and exactly 5 rounds in the cylinder of his primary revolver. He did not feel the weight of the odds against him. He only felt the dry, alkaline wind of the Big Bend brushing against his skin, a sensation that signaled the environment of his final theater of war. By 8 o'clock in the morning, Tracy descended from the ridge and approached the ranch of the Eddy brothers, located roughly 6 miles southeast of Creston. He moved with a deliberate lack of stealth, riding directly into the yard where the heat was already shimmering off the dry timber of the barn. He found the ranch hands and the owners preparing for the day's labor. At gunpoint, he forced the men to stable his horse and provide him with a heavy meal of salt pork and potatoes. As he ate, he sat with his back to a solid oak cupboard, his Winchester resting across his thighs. He questioned the Eddy brothers about the movements of the local sheriff, Gardner, and the presence of any strangers in the area. The grit of the situation was the silent, vibrating tension in the room. The ranchers knew that a single misstep would result in a high-velocity projectile through the chest. Tracy informed them that he was tired of the chase and intended to rest, but he remained as vigilant as a hawk, his ears tuned to the rhythmic clicking of the rural telephone wires outside. The environment of the Eddy Ranch was a labyrinth of tall, golden wheat that stood 5 feet high, providing a sea of concealment that stretched in every direction. At 11 o'clock in the morning, Tracy instructed the men to build a stone breastwork near a basalt outcropping behind the house. He was not preparing for a flight. He was preparing for a siege. He spent the midday hours cleaning the internal mechanism of his rifle, using a scrap of cloth and a drop of machine oil he found in the barn. He meticulously inspected each brass cartridge for corrosion or dents, knowing that a single jam would be the final mechanical failure of his life. The heat peaked at 12 o'clock noon, the temperature reaching 98 degrees, making the air thick with the smell of dry straw and horse sweat. Tracy did not seek the shade of the house, preferring the tactical vantage point of the rocks where he could monitor the 360-degree perimeter of the wheat. The alarm was raised at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. A local youth had spotted Tracy from a distance and rode at a gallop to Creston to alert a 5-man posse consisting of C.A. Straub, Maurice Smith, E.E. Lanter, J.J. Morrison, and Frank Fellows. These were not military men or professional detectives, but local citizens and a deputy who had been galvanized by the massive reward and the desire to end the terror. They arrived at the edge of the Eddy property at 5 o'clock in the evening, moving cautiously through the wheat. Tracy spotted the glint of sunlight on a rifle barrel at a distance of 400 yards. He did not fire immediately. He waited behind his stone breastwork, his breathing slow and shallow to maintain a steady aim. He watched as the men fanned out, attempting to encircle the outcropping. The silence of the plateau was absolute, broken only by the distant lonely call of a meadowlark. The battle commenced at 6 o'clock and 30 minutes in the evening. The posse moved into a ravine that offered a partial line of sight to the rocks. Tracy fired the first shot, the report of the Winchester .30-30 cracking through the still air like a whip. The round struck a rock inches from Maurice Smith's head, showering the man with basalt splinters. The posse returned fire with a disorganized volley, their bullets thudding into the earth and the stone walls of the breastwork. Tracy worked the lever of his rifle with a cold, rhythmic cadence, firing every time a hat or a shoulder appeared above the level of the wheat. He moved from one side of the rocks to the other, creating the illusion of multiple shooters. The brutality of the exchange was defined by the proximity. The men were often less than 50 yards apart, separated only by the stalks of grain and the drifting clouds of gray powder smoke. At 7 o'clock in the evening, the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long orange shadows that made target identification difficult. Tracy decided to break for the cover of a large haystack and a nearby barn to broaden his field of fire. As he sprinted across an open stretch of 75 feet, the posse opened a concentrated barrage. A round fired by Frank Fellows struck the basalt wall, ricocheted, and tore into Tracy's right leg. The projectile shattered the tibia and severed the femoral artery, the impact spinning him around and slamming him into the dirt. The pain was an instantaneous white-hot explosion that radiated through his entire lower body. He managed to crawl into the tall wheat, leaving a thick, dark trail of arterial blood on the dry stalks. He reached the shelter of a small depression in the earth, his breath coming in ragged, wet gasps as he realized the severity of the injury. The physical reality of the wound was catastrophic. The blood was pumping from his leg in rhythmic, heavy surges, soaking his trousers and the soil beneath him. Tracy knew the mechanics of the human body well enough to understand that he was bleeding out and that he had only minutes of consciousness remaining. He attempted to fashion a tourniquet using his leather belt, but his fingers were becoming clumsy and cold despite the lingering heat of the day. The posse, wary of a trap, did not advance immediately. They stayed in their positions, firing occasional rounds into the area where they had seen him fall. Tracy lay in the darkness of the wheat, the sky turning a deep bruised purple above him. He felt the life force receding from his limbs, replaced by a heavy terminal lethality. He reached for his revolver, the steel feeling impossibly heavy in his weakening grip. At 9 o'clock in the evening, the silence returned to the field. Tracy was alone in the darkness, the only sound the distant shouting of the posse as they coordinated their perimeter. He looked at the stars, his mind remaining sharp even as his heart labored to move the remaining fluid through his veins. He had no intention of allowing the state of Washington to claim credit for his capture or to see him dangle from a gallows in Salem. He placed the muzzle of his revolver against his right temple, the cold iron a final, familiar comfort. He did not hesitate or offer a prayer. He squeezed the trigger. The discharge was a final, singular flash in the tall wheat, the round passing through his brain and exiting the opposite side of his skull, ending the life of Harry Tracy instantly. The posse did not find the body until the first light of dawn on August 7th, 1902, at 5 o'clock and 15 minutes in the morning. They moved through the wheat with rifles leveled, discovering the outlaw lying on his back, his face a pale mask in the morning dew. The blood had dried into a black crust on his leg and the surrounding earth. The discovery was met with a mixture of profound relief and a dark, lingering awe. The man who had terrorized the Northwest, killed at least 10 people, and eluded thousands of searchers was finally reduced to a still, cold weight in the dirt. They loaded his body onto a wagon and transported it to Creston, where a crowd of hundreds gathered to view the remains of the king of the outlaws. The grit of the scene was the sight of the self-inflicted wound, a final act of defiance that robbed the law of its ultimate victory. The historical significance of Harry Tracy's death marked the definitive end of the era of the frontier bandit in the Pacific Northwest. He was the last of the high-stakes outlaws who could turn a state into a war zone through the sheer application of individual violence and tactical skill. His actions changed the Old West by forcing a modernization of law enforcement, leading to better interstate cooperation and the eventual formation of more professional state police forces. The brutality of his 2-month campaign left a permanent scar on the collective memory of Oregon and Washington, a reminder of the fragility of civilization when faced with a man who had completely rejected its rules. He was a humanized tragedy, a product of a violent childhood and a lawless landscape, who had chosen to become a monster rather than a victim. The disposal of the body was as macabre as the life that preceded it. Tracy's remains were taken to an undertaking parlor in Davenport, where he was photographed and viewed by thousands of curious onlookers who paid a nickel for the privilege. Souvenir hunters went so far as to strip the hair from his head and pieces of clothing from his corpse before the authorities intervened. The lack of respect for the dead was a mirror of the lack of respect Tracy had shown for the living. He was eventually buried in the prison cemetery in Salem, Oregon, the very place he had drenched in blood on June 9th. He was placed in an unmarked grave, the state attempting to erase the man after failing to contain him. The ironies of his life and death were numerous, but for Tracy the only reality was the cold earth of the wheat field and the finality of the copper-jacketed projectile. This was the conclusion of the war, a conflict that had spanned 3 states and dozens of lives, ending in the silence of a Washington sunrise. The impact on the families of the victims remained long after the smoke cleared from the Creston fields. The guards at Salem, the deputies in Bothell, and the civilians along the trail were the permanent collateral damage of Tracy's autonomy. Their stories were the dark underside of the legend, the human cost of a man who viewed other people as obstacles or targets. The significance of Tracy's infamous stand was that it proved the transition from the 19th to the 20th century would be written in blood. He was the ghost of the frontier, a jagged piece of the past that the future had finally managed to grind down. As the years passed, the details of his crimes were often romanticized, but the gritty reality remained in the ledgers of the coroners and the memories of the men who hunted him. Tracy's legacy as a tactician of the long hunt was studied by lawmen for decades. His ability to utilize the terrain, his marksmanship, and his psychological manipulation of hostages were all recognized as the work of a highly disciplined, if pathological mind. He had turned a manhunt into a formal war, utilizing every asset of the wilderness to offset the numbers of his pursuers. He had proven that a single man with a Winchester could paralyze a city and outfight a state militia. The war ended not because the law was smarter or faster, but because the biological limits of the human body eventually failed under the pressure of a shattered bone and a severed artery. He died as he lived, violently, alone, and entirely on his own terms. The story of Harry Tracy, from the Wisconsin barn to the Creston wheat, is a map of the American West's darkest impulses. The brutality was the point, the grit was the environment. There was no poetry in the blood on the wheat, only the physics of a copper projectile and the end of a long, lethal journey. He was Harry Tracy, real name Harry Severns, and the war was finally over. By 12 o'clock noon on August 7th, the telegrams had reached every major city in the country. The national fascination with the case began to fade as new headlines took its place. But in the small towns of the Northwest, the fear lingered for a generation. Every slamming door and every midnight hoofbeat was a reminder of the man who had turned their world into a killing ground. The historical context of 1902 was one of progress. But Harry Tracy was the reminder that beneath the surface of the new century, the old violence remained, waiting for the right man and the right rifle to bring it back to the surface.